At 4:47 a.m. on New Year's Day, while fireworks still exploded across the Meridian city sky, a 24-year-old woman ran barefoot through the basement of a high-rise building, blood dripping onto the cold concrete. Her pursuer was the man she had once entrusted her life to, and the only one who stood up to protect her was a man the entire nation believed had been dead for 18 months. If you enjoy stories of mystery, betrayal, and the rise from the shadows, please watch to the end, like, and comment with the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed. The fireworks were still going when Nora Ellery lost her left shoe. She didn't stop to look for it. The concrete floor of the parking garage was cold enough to burn through the sole of her right foot, and the wet slap of her bare heel against the painted floor felt louder than anything she'd ever heard in her life. Louder than the celebration 300 feet above her, louder than the blood hammering through her ears, louder than the distant crack of the new year splitting open the sky. She ran because stopping meant dying. That wasn't a figure of speech. She was 24 years old, and she understood it with a clarity that no amount of prior fear had ever given her. Not the car accident at 17 that left her with a scar along her collarbone. Not the night 3 years ago when a man followed her 6 blocks home before she ducked into a laundromat and waited 2 hours for him to disappear. This was different. This was a very specific and personal type of dying, the kind that comes with a name attached, the kind where someone who once knew the way you cried in your sleep decides you've become a liability. Camden Thorne had said it himself 3 minutes ago. He'd said it while pressing his palm flat against the center of her chest, his voice absolutely level, his eyes showing nothing that resembled the man she'd spent 2 years agreeing to marry. He'd said, "You don't leave this building, Nora." She'd left the building. Or she was trying to. The elevator had been cut. She'd stabbed the button 6 times before understanding it was pointless. And the stairwell door to the lobby had a man standing on the other side of it, visible through the narrow wire glass window, just standing there with his hands at his sides like he was waiting for something specific. So she'd gone down. One level, then another, until she hit the parking garage and the overhead fluorescence and the rows of expensive cars sitting in the kind of silence that feels arranged rather than natural. Her left arm was bleeding from the wrist. Not deeply. Camden hadn't meant to cut her when he grabbed for her phone. His signet ring had just caught the edge of her skin in the wrong way, but the blood had soaked through the sleeve of her dress, and now it dripped in a slow rhythm as she moved, leaving small dark circles on the concrete that she didn't have time to worry about. The dress was wrong for any of this. It was a black cocktail dress, the kind of thing you wear to a New Year's Eve party hosted in a penthouse for 100 people who all know each other and none of whom are your friends. She'd worn it because Camden had asked her to, because Camden had very specific opinions about how she presented herself in rooms full of people who mattered to him, and she had spent 2 years slowly learning the exact weight of that opinion and how much of herself she'd given up to accommodate it. The recordings were still on her phone. That was the thing. That was the whole thing. 6 months of recordings, made in the slow, incremental way of someone who doesn't quite believe what they're learning. A fragment here, a conversation there, the pieces assembling themselves into a shape so ugly that she'd spent 3 of those months convincing herself she was misinterpreting it. 2 people had disappeared connected to Thorne Aldrich Development. Then a third, a property attorney named Garver who'd been building a case against Camden's father, a city inspector named Wolf who'd refused a bribe, and most recently a woman named Dale Prescott, who Nora had never met but whose photograph she'd found inside a folder in Camden's private desk during a night when he was traveling, and she'd told herself she was just looking for a charger. She'd stopped telling herself she was misinterpreting it around the time she found Dale Prescott's name listed in a document alongside 2 words that made Nora's stomach drop through the floor. Resolved and permanent. 6 months of careful work. 6 months of keeping her expression neutral over dinner, of answering his questions without hesitation, of sleeping in his bed while her phone charged on the nightstand with everything she needed to destroy him sitting quietly in its memory. She'd planned to be 2 states away before he found out. She had not planned on his assistant Elena finding her in the study at 11 p.m. on New Year's Eve while the party was 3 floors up and the city outside was counting down. She had not planned on Elena's face doing the thing it did when she saw what was open on the laptop screen. Not shock, not confusion, but something calculating and immediate. the face of someone making a decision rather than having one made for them. Elena had closed the study door behind her, and 20 minutes later, Camden Thorne knew everything. Nora reached the far end of the parking garage and pressed herself against the concrete pillar at the corner near the service corridor. She could hear voices from the elevator bank, two of them, men, speaking in short clipped sentences the way people do when they've been trained to communicate efficiently in the dark. She pressed her back to the pillar and tried to slow her breathing and look down at her phone. The screen was cracked. Camden had managed to grab her wrist once before she'd twisted free, and the phone had hit the floor and she'd scooped it back up without looking, so she didn't know until now how bad the damage was. 3 cracks radiating from the upper right corner, spreading across the screen like a frozen impact pattern. The face recognition wasn't working. She typed her passcode with shaking fingers and got it wrong twice before it let her in. She had no one to call. That wasn't self-pity, it was logistical. Her sister lived in Vancouver and wouldn't believe her, or worse, would call Camden first to understand the situation. Her 2 close friends from college had both drifted away in the 2 years she'd been folded into Camden's life, their texts going unanswered during the periods when he'd made her feel guilty for giving attention to anyone outside the relationship. The detective she'd spoken to once, 6 weeks ago, had listened to her carefully and then told her that recordings made without consent weren't admissible and that disappearances without bodies were extremely difficult to prosecute, and she'd left his office understanding that the law was not currently built to help her. Her recent calls showed 3 numbers. Her dentist, confirming an appointment she'd never make. Her mother. And an unknown number that had called 4 days ago, 9 seconds long, no voicemail. She didn't know why she called it. Desperation isn't rational. It's just what's left when every rational option has been eliminated. She pressed the unknown number and put the phone to her ear and listened to it ring once, then twice, and she was already composing the explanation she'd leave on voicemail, already trying to figure out how to compress 6 months of fear into a message short enough to be heard before someone found her. "Who gave you this number?" The voice was low and careful, a man's voice, not angry, but absolutely precise in the way that questions become demands when delivered by someone who doesn't expect to be lied to. Nora opened her mouth. From the other side of the parking garage, a flashlight beam cut across the row of cars. Then the overhead lights went out. The darkness was total and sudden, the kind that takes a moment to feel real. Nora stopped breathing. She heard her own heartbeat. She heard the footsteps of the 2 men near the elevator bank slow and then stop. Heard one of them say something low and sharp, a question, a reaction. And then she heard something else entirely, something that didn't fit the soundscape of the garage at all. A silenced shot is not silent. It is a compressed mechanical sound like a staple gun fired inside a closet. Then another, then a third, then a short and violent scuffle that lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then nothing. The emergency backup lights came on, red-tinted, dim, casting the garage in the color of something medical. Nora kept her back to the pillar and forced herself to look. 2 men were on the floor near the elevator bank. A third was on his knees halfway down the row of cars, hands pressed to his side, expression blank with shock. Standing between the third man and Nora, not looking at her yet, still watching the rest of the garage with the steady surveillance of someone cataloging threats, was a man in a charcoal trench coat, holding a silenced pistol with the kind of ease that comes from years of repetition rather than adrenaline. He was tall, not unusually so, but built in a way that the coat didn't hide. Wide through the shoulders, a quality of physical density that suggested he'd been made for difficult conditions and had lived inside them long enough to stop noticing. His face was angular, jaw set, dark eyes currently moving across the far corners of the garage with professional patience. Then he looked at her. Nora felt something happen to her breathing that she didn't have a word for. She knew that face, not from her life, not from any room she'd ever been in. She knew that face from television, from newspaper front pages, from the kind of coverage that takes up 3 consecutive nights of the national news cycle. She knew it from the footage she'd watched 18 months ago of a prison riot in a correctional facility outside Meridian, the fire that had killed 11 inmates and 2 guards. She knew it from the photograph the networks had run over and over, the dark coat, the specific quality of stillness in the face, During the weeks when federal prosecutors had confirmed that the body recovered from the fire belonged to the man who'd spent 9 years running the most sophisticated criminal organization the Eastern Seaboard had produced in 40 years. Damien Voss. The Voss Syndicate. 12 federal indictments. RICO charges. The longest and most expensive organized crime trial in Meridian's judicial history. Convicted on 7 counts. Sentenced to life without parole. Killed in the riot before he ever served a full year. She'd watched his death on the news. She'd watched it with Camden, sitting on the white sectional in the penthouse living room, Camden's arm around her shoulders. Camden saying something like, "That's what happens," in the tone of a man who believes in a particular kind of justice without examining too carefully who administers it. But the man standing in the red-lit parking garage of Camden Thorne's building was not dead. He crossed the distance between them in 8 steps, moving around the kneeling man without looking at him, and when he reached her, he put his hand around her arm. Not roughly, but with complete certainty, the grip of someone who has decided what happens next and requires her cooperation to execute it. "Walk," he said. "Walk now." She walked. He took her through the service corridor at the far end of the garage, through a steel door that opened onto an alley where snow had been falling for the past 2 hours and was already 3 inches deep on the ground. The cold hit her bare feet like a physical blow. She sucked in a breath. He didn't slow down. "My shoes. There's a car at the end of the alley. I don't understand what's—" "I know you don't." He was scanning the roof lines, the fire escape landings, the dark windows of the adjacent building. "Keep moving." There was a car, a dark sedan, unremarkable, the kind of vehicle that exists in a city primarily to not be noticed. He opened the passenger door and she got in because the alternative was standing barefoot in the snow in a parking garage dress at 5 in the morning with Camden Thorne's men somewhere in the building above her. He got in the driver's side and pulled into the alley without turning the headlights on until they reached the street. The city was still celebrating around them in scattered pockets. A group of people coming out of a bar 2 blocks down, someone setting off a wheel of colored sparks from a stoop, the distant sound of music from a rooftop party being carried down by the wind. The ordinary aftermath of midnight, the world resuming itself as though nothing had changed. Nora sat in the passenger seat with her bloody arm folded against her chest and looked at the profile of a dead man driving her through the new year. "You called a line that's been inactive for 14 months, he said. Not a question. "I didn't know what it was." "How'd you get the number?" She thought about it. "It came up on my phone 4 days ago. I don't know who called. They didn't leave a message." He was quiet for a moment in a way that felt like he was recalculating something. "The line was supposed to be buried." "I don't know what that means." "No." He glanced at her once, briefly. The kind of glance that takes in information rather than offering it. "You're bleeding." "I know." "The sleeve. Press it harder." She pressed it harder. They drove for 11 minutes without speaking. Nora watched the city move past the window and tried to organize her understanding of the situation into something functional, something with edges she could work with. She was in a car with a man who was officially dead. She had evidence of multiple murders on a phone with a cracked screen. The man she'd been engaged to was currently, presumably, directing people to find her. And somewhere in the early morning darkness of Meridian City, whatever fragile thing she'd understood her life to be was already gone, replaced by something she didn't have a framework for yet. She looked at him. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere you won't be found tonight." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have right now." She looked back at the window. A billboard slid past, advertising something happy. "They're going to say I'm crazy," she said. "If I go to the police, Camden has people. He has—" "I know who Camden Thorne has." The flatness of it stopped her. Not dismissive, informational. The statement of someone for whom Camden Thorne's network of influence is already cataloged and accounted for. "You know him?" "I know of him. His father did business with people I used to know." The careful phrasing landed on her. Used to know. Past tense carrying a specific kind of weight. "What are you doing here?" she asked. They said you died. I watched it on the news. They showed—" "I know what they showed." "Then what?" Not now. You don't get to... Nora. He said her name the way you say a word when you need someone to stop. Not harshly, with a precision that made it function like a door closing. Not now. There are things coming in the next few hours that require your attention to survive. I'll answer what I can answer when there's time. Right now I need you functional, not informed. She stared at him. That's a profoundly terrible thing to say to someone, she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a reaction, the ghost of one. Yeah, he said. I know. He pulled the car into a narrow side street behind a row of converted warehouses in the Western District, an area Nora associated vaguely with art galleries and industrial lofts, and the kind of neighborhood that's in the process of becoming something else. The building he stopped in front of had no visible signage, its ground floor windows painted over from the inside, a fire escape running up its face with one landing missing. She followed him inside. The space was a former switching room for an electrical substation, converted into something livable in the utilitarian sense. A folding cot in the corner, a card table with a laptop, a portable heater that was already running, a first aid kit open on the floor. The walls were bare concrete. There were no windows that looked out onto the street. The only light came from two standing lamps and the laptop screen. He moved immediately to the card table. She stood in the center of the room with her arms wrapped around herself and looked at the space with the eyes of someone trying to decide how frightened she should be. Sit, he said, gesturing toward the cot. I'll stand. He looked at her. The look acknowledged the refusal without fighting it. He moved to the first aid kit and crouched beside it and came up with antiseptic wipes and a roll of gauze. Give me your arm. She crossed the room because her arm had started to throb, and she was cold, and the cost of stubbornness in this particular moment felt disproportionate. She held her arm out. He unwrapped it with practiced efficiency, cleaned the cut without commentary, dressed it with 3 strips of tape and a folded piece of gauze. You've done this before, she said. Many times. On yourself or both? His hands were steady. There was an old scar along his left knuckle that had healed without proper attention, a ridge of raised tissue she could see when the lamp caught it right. There were others on his forearm, partially obscured by his sleeve. She became aware, quite suddenly, that she was standing very close to a man she didn't know, in a room with no windows, in a city that was going to wake up in a few hours and have a very different understanding of who she was. My name is Nora Ellery, 24. Graduate degree in urban policy, currently working as a planning consultant for the city. Engaged to Camden Thorne as of 13 months ago. Previously employed by Thorne Aldrich Development as a junior analyst before the relationship became public. He paused. They fired you as a liability. You stayed in the relationship anyway. She stared at him. You have a file on me. I have files on everyone connected to Thorne Aldrich. Why? He didn't answer immediately. He secured the last piece of tape and released her arm and stood, putting the gauze back in the kit with the same methodical efficiency he'd used throughout. Because Camden Thorne's father destroyed a great number of things, he said finally, and Camden learned everything from him, including the disappearances. His eyes moved to hers. You know about those. I've been documenting them for 6 months. She pulled out her phone. It's all here. Garver, Wolf, Dale Prescott. There are at least 2 others I've identified with probable connections. A contractor named Reyes and a city council aide who died in a car accident that... He moved fast. Not at her. Toward her, specifically to look at the phone. And the abruptness of it made her flinch backward before she understood what he was doing. He caught the motion and stopped. Put a deliberate 2 feet of space between them. I need to see that, he said carefully. If you'll allow it. She handed him the phone. He went through it with the focused attention of someone who reads information the way others read language. Not sequentially, but in patterns, picking out what matters and filing it at a speed that had nothing to do with how fast the average person absorbed text. She watched him and tried to understand what she was looking at. He was someone who'd spent his life inside systems most people only read about. He knew how organizations buried things, how money moved through shell companies, how a property development empire could function as a mechanism for making people disappear. He knew it not from research, but from architecture. from having built things like it, or adjacent to it, or from the inside. Prescott knew something, he said, scrolling. She was a title examiner. She would have had access to the chain of ownership on the Harlow parcels. That's what I thought. He looked up from the phone. You thought right. He held the phone for another moment, then handed it back. The recordings are evidence of conspiracy. Not enough for a conviction on its own, but enough to force an investigation that can't be buried. Combined with the ownership documentation on the parcels and the financial records from the Garver case, I have some of those. Partial copies. I photographed documents from his study over the course of 4 months. He looked at her differently then. Not warmly, but with a recalibrated attention, the kind of adjustment that comes from realizing you've been underestimating the person in front of you. You've been doing this alone, he said. Yes. For 6 months. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Outside somewhere, fireworks were still going. Distant now, the last of the amateurs, someone dragging the celebration into the small hours because the year was still new and the cold hadn't made them stop yet. That was reckless, he said. I know. You could have gotten yourself killed. I know that too. She looked at him steadily. But I wasn't going to pretend I hadn't seen it. Something shifted in his expression. The smallest possible shift, the kind that's visible only because everything else in his face stays completely controlled. Then his phone vibrated. He looked at it, his jaw tightened by a degree. What? She asked. He showed her the screen, a news alert 3 minutes old from the Meridian City Police Department's official feed. The headline read, Woman sought in connection with assault at Thorne property. Ellery Nora, 24. Below it was her photograph, her work headshot, the one from the Planning Commission's website, the one where she was smiling in front of a neutral background, looking exactly like the kind of person who wouldn't survive a week inside whatever she'd walked into. She read the alert twice. He moved fast, she said. He was prepared. Damien was already at the laptop. This isn't improvised. He had this ready to deploy, which means he's been expecting something like this for a while. Or he had it ready for me specifically. Damien looked at her across the room. Tell me something, he said. The recordings. Did you ever give him any reason to know you had them? She almost said no. Then she remembered one night, 4 months ago, when she'd made a mistake, when Camden had said something over dinner about the Harlow development and she'd felt her expression do something that it shouldn't have, felt the flicker of recognition cross her face before she'd controlled it. He'd looked at her for a long second and then kept talking, and she'd decided afterward that she'd imagined the look, that he hadn't noticed, that she was being paranoid. She hadn't been paranoid. He knew, she said quietly. He's known for a while and he let me keep going. Because he needed to know how much you had, and who I'd talked to, and who you'd talked to when you ran. Damien closed the laptop. Which means any contact you'd normally reach for is already being monitored. The cold in the room felt different now, not environmental, structural. Then I have nobody, she said. You have the evidence. Evidence doesn't drive a car. No, he agreed. He moved to the far side of the room and stood looking at the painted-over window as though he could still see through it, his back to her, the line of his shoulders carrying a stillness that looked like it had been built over time rather than born. Why did you help me? She asked. In the garage. You didn't know who I was. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. You called a line that's been silent for over a year, he said, and something on the other end of that line decided to answer. He paused. I've been waiting in this city for 8 months for a specific kind of opening. The recordings on your phone, combined with what I already have, they may be exactly what that is. What are you waiting for an opening to do? He turned around. His face in the lamplight was tired in a way that had nothing to do with one night's lost sleep. It was the kind of tired that comes from carrying something specific for a very long time through conditions that made it heavier with every mile. There are people who did something to me, he said, and before I can touch them, I needed someone to give me a reason that was worth the exposure. I'm not a reason, she said. I'm a person. I know that. Then act like it. The ghost of a reaction at the corner of his mouth again. Barely there, but there. Get some sleep, he said. You're going to need it. I can't sleep. Try anyway. She looked at the cot in the corner. She looked at the lamp. She looked at the door with its 3 reinforced bolts and the portable heater doing its adequate best against the January cold. She sat on the edge of the cot and put her face in her hands and breathed. Outside, the last fireworks of Meridian City's New Year faded into the dark. She didn't cry. She didn't have the energy for it. And besides, there was something underneath the fear now. Something harder than fear. Something with edges. The feeling of a person who has spent 6 months accommodating the weight of a secret and is only now beginning to understand that the secret was always heavier than the lie it was protecting. She looked up. Damien Voss was at the card table, working through something on the laptop with the focused attention of a man who doesn't waste time on anything that isn't essential. He hadn't asked her if she was okay. He hadn't told her everything was going to be fine. He hadn't offered the kind of comfort that exists primarily to make the person offering it feel useful. She wasn't sure if that made her trust him less or more. Her phone was still in her hand. The news alert was still on the screen. Her face, smiling, already a wanted person in a city that was going to wake up in a few hours and have no idea what had actually happened inside that parking garage. She thought about the look on Camden's face when he'd pressed his palm against her chest. That flat, administrative certainty. The face of a man who has made a decision and is simply executing it. She looked at the man across the room. She didn't know what Damien Voss had done. She didn't know everything he'd been. She knew the headlines, the indictments, the specific lexicon the news had used to describe him: criminal architect, shadow economy, untouchable until he wasn't. She knew the things people said about him in the same tone they used for natural disasters, with a kind of awe that was also acknowledgement that some forces are simply beyond the scale of ordinary resistance. She knew one other thing. He'd walked into that garage for a reason that was his own. He was keeping her alive for a reason that was his own. And at some point in the next few hours or days, when the city fully turned toward finding her, and the people who had apparently faked his death decided that his reappearance was a problem that needed solving. She looked at the cracked phone screen, at her photograph. The news alert had a timestamp. She looked more carefully at the metadata at the bottom of the report. Standard format, precinct ID, the case number prefix used for. The case number prefix was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Structurally wrong. The Meridian PD used a 6-digit prefix for active warrants. This one had 7 digits, with a format she'd seen before. Not in police records, but in documentation she'd photographed from Camden's study. An internal filing system. A private one. This alert hadn't come from the police department. Someone had fabricated it and pushed it through a channel that could reach the major news aggregators directly without going through the actual department. Damien. He looked up. She held up the phone. This alert is fake. Look at the case number format. He crossed the room in 4 steps and looked at the screen. His face did something she hadn't seen it do yet. Not alarm, something older and colder than alarm. Recognition. That prefix, he said. You've seen it. Once. He took the phone from her hand very carefully and stared at the number at the bottom of the alert for a long moment. A long time ago, in a facility that officially doesn't exist. The room felt very quiet. What facility? She asked. He handed the phone back. Get some sleep, he said again. But this time there was something different in it. A tightness, a compression, like a sentence that ends before it's finished. Damien, what facility? He stood with his back to her for a moment, facing the painted-over window. When he turned around, his face had closed in the way of a man deciding how much truth a situation can currently hold. The people who destroyed my life, he said quietly, didn't do it because I was a criminal. They did it because I refused to keep working for them. He paused. They have a name, but they don't appear in any public record, and they just put your face on every screen in this city. Nora sat very still. Which means they know about me. Which means they've been watching this situation longer than either of us realized. His jaw was set. And they're not afraid of exposure, which means they believe they can manage it. Can they? He looked at her. They managed my death, he said. The portable heater clicked and hummed. Somewhere in the building, a pipe settled with a low groan. Outside, Meridian City was breathing in the last of the fireworks smoke, the new year settling around it like something inevitable, and Nora Ellery sat in a room with a dead man and understood, with a cold and specific clarity, that the recordings on her cracked phone were no longer just evidence against Camden Thorne. They were evidence of something much larger, and whatever door she'd accidentally kicked open when she'd dialed that number 4 days ago had not simply let something out. It had let something in. She didn't sleep. She'd lay on the cot with her eyes closed and listen to Damien work. The soft mechanical percussion of keys, the occasional scrape of the chair, once the low controlled sound of him speaking to someone on a phone she hadn't seen him produce. His voice too quiet to decode from across the room. The portable heater cycled on and off. The building settled around them in its old way, pipes and concrete making the sounds of things that have been standing in cold for a long time. Around 6 in the morning, she gave up on the pretense and sat up. Damien was at the card table with his back to her, 3 empty coffee cups arranged to his left with the unconscious geometry of a man who doesn't notice his own habits. The laptop screen cast a pale rectangle across the side of his face. He hadn't changed his position in any significant way since she'd lain down 2 hours ago. "There's coffee," he said, without turning around. "From where?" "Cabinet above the sink." She found the sink behind a partial wall at the back of the space. A single basin, cold water only, a hot plate on the shelf beside it with a stovetop espresso maker already loaded. She lit the hot plate and stood waiting for it in bare feet on cold concrete, her arms wrapped around herself, and looked at the water stain on the wall in front of her, and thought about Dale Prescott. She'd never met Dale Prescott. She knew her only from a photograph and from the careful clinical language of the document she'd found in Camden's desk, the one that used the word resolved like it was a business outcome. Like a person's continued existence was a variable that had been successfully removed from an equation. Dale Prescott had been 31. She'd had a cat, according to her social media, which Nora had found and then couldn't stop looking at. The ordinary accumulation of a person's small pleasures, the cat in a sunbeam, the cat on a stack of books, the cat in a knitted sweater for a holiday photo. The espresso maker hissed. She poured 2 cups and carried one to the card table and set it beside the existing 3 empties. Damien looked at it, then at her. "You're not sleeping," he said. "Observant. You need to." "I need a lot of things." She pulled the folding chair from the corner and sat down across from him. "Tell me about the case number." He looked at her with the expression of a man deciding whether to spend something he'd been conserving. "Section 9, he said. "That's not an answer." "It's a name. That's where the answer starts." He turned the laptop slightly so she could see the screen. A document, dense with text, no header. Section 9 is an operational unit, off books. It runs inside the federal intelligence apparatus, the way a parasite runs inside a host, using the body's resources, invisible to the immune system, producing nothing that appears on any official ledger. "What does it do?" "What I used to do," he said, but without the organizational structure that at least required accountability to someone. Section 9 eliminates problems, political ones primarily. People who've become inconvenient to a specific set of interests that sit above the level where normal oversight applies. Nora was quiet for a moment. The coffee was strong and too hot, and she drank it anyway. "And you worked for them." "I worked adjacent to them. The syndicate ran operations that Section 9 found useful. Money movement, personnel, infrastructure. They contracted through intermediaries. I didn't know the full architecture until they decided they wanted me internal." He paused. "I refused." "Why?" The question landed in the air between them and stayed there for a beat. "Because what they were doing had nothing to do with anything I'd ever told myself justified the way I lived," he said. It was flat, without apology. The statement of someone who has already done the accounting and isn't interested in performing the math again for an audience. I'd spent 9 years building something that operated on a specific kind of logic, brutal often, but logical. What Section 9 was doing was different. Different how? They weren't solving problems, they were manufacturing them. He turned the laptop back toward himself. Garver wasn't just inconvenient to Camden Thorne, he was inconvenient to 3 Section 9 contractors who had money in the Harlow parcels. Wolf was investigating a building inspection irregularity that connected to a construction company that Section 9 used as a front for moving personnel across state lines. He looked at her. Your recordings aren't just evidence of Camden Thorne's crimes. They're a thread that leads directly into the operational financing of a federal black program. Nora set her coffee cup down. They were always going to come after me, she said slowly, even if Camden hadn't found out. Eventually. How eventually? The Prescott disappearance happened 9 months ago. You started investigating 6 months ago. He said it without inflection. You were 18 months behind a machine that was already watching the same territory. She absorbed this. You said you've been in Meridian for 8 months. Yes, waiting for an opening. Waiting for documentation I couldn't fabricate. Evidence with a source that couldn't be dismissed. He looked at her steadily. You've been building it without knowing what you were building. And now that I know, now it's more dangerous than it was yesterday. For both of us. She looked at the document on the laptop screen. Dense paragraphs, dates, what appeared to be financial routing numbers. Is that about them? She asked. Part of it? How long have you been building it? 18 months. He said it the way you say a number that represents something other than time. 18 months. The length of his officially recorded death. She did the math without wanting to and felt the weight of it. 1.5 years of a man living inside the negative space of his own existence, collecting evidence in a city that believed he was ash, building a case against people who had the resources to make cases disappear. Where were you? She asked. Before Meridian. His jaw shifted. Not somewhere I'm going to describe to you at 6 in the morning. You said you'd answer what you could answer when there was time. I said when there was time. He glanced at the laptop. There isn't. As if in punctuation, his phone vibrated on the table. He looked at it. Something in his posture changed, not visibly, but she felt it, the quality of his stillness shifting from deliberate to loaded. What? She said. He turned the phone so she could see it. A text. No contact name, just a number. 4 words. Garage footage is public. She felt the blood leave her face. Already, she said. They have people inside the department who can accelerate the process. He was already standing, folding the laptop. It means anyone looking for you now has visual confirmation that you were in that garage with me, which means the story stops being fugitive woman and becomes fugitive woman with dead crime boss, she said, which is a story Section 9 can use to discredit everything on that phone before it ever reaches anyone who matters. He was moving with the rapid economy of someone executing a plan that already existed, pulling a bag from beneath the cot, loading it with the laptop and several items from the card table. She stood up. We're leaving. Yes. Where? Somewhere with more distance and less exposure. She followed him to the door and he stopped with his hand on the top bolt and looked back at the room once with the expression of a man assessing what he's leaving behind. Nothing sentimental in it. Just inventory. Have you ever used a secondary identity? What? He asked. What? A different name, documentation that isn't yours. No. You're going to need one. He slid the bolt. I have what you'll need, but we have to move in the next 20 minutes before the morning traffic gives the cameras too much coverage. You have documentation ready for me. I have documentation ready for several contingencies. You became one of them around 3 this morning. She didn't know whether to feel reassured by that or unsettled by it. She settled on both, which seemed honest. They went out into the alley. The snow had stopped during the night and left the city under 2 inches of gray-white compression, already going to slush at the curb edges where the salt trucks had been through. The sky was the color of old aluminum, dawn somewhere behind it, but not yet visible. Her breath came out in short clouds. She was still in the black dress, which was absurd, which she was aware of and couldn't do anything about yet. He produced a coat from the bag, dark gray, too large for her, the kind of anonymous garment that exists in a city without belonging to any particular person, and held it out without comment. She put it on. The car was gone. In its place, parked at the alley exit, was a different vehicle entirely, an older model SUV and a dark green that read almost black in the morning light. He got in the driver's side without explaining the change, and she got in the passenger side without asking. Different car, she said as he pulled out. The sedan is burned. How do you know? Because I burned it. She looked at him. At 4:30 this morning, he said, while you were not sleeping, I moved the vehicle. I don't operate in places where I've already been exposed. He checked the mirror. Basic practice. She thought about what basic practice meant for a man who had spent 18 months being officially dead in a city that had watched his funeral coverage on the evening news. Tell me about Section 9, she said. Not the function. The people. Why? Because if I'm in this, I need to understand what I'm in. He was quiet long enough that she thought he was going to deflect again. Then, the director is a man named Malcolm Reeve, former deputy director of a federal intelligence agency. I won't specify which, it doesn't matter, and it changes the story in ways that aren't useful. He built Section 9 over 12 years. It currently has operational capacity in 14 cities, a contractor network of approximately 60 active personnel, and financial infrastructure spread across shell companies in 7 jurisdictions. He paused. He has 2 qualities that make him exceptionally dangerous. The first is that he has no ego about credit. Everything Section 9 does disappears into noise. He doesn't need acknowledgement. The second is that he has genuinely convinced himself that what he does is necessary. And is it? No. No hesitation. People who believe their methods are justified by their objectives are the most dangerous kind because they've already solved the internal problem. There's no conflict left to slow them down. She looked out the window. The city was beginning to wake around them. Delivery trucks, the first commuters, a woman walking a dog who looked like she hadn't slept either and was grateful for the company. What did they do to you? Nora said. Specifically. The muscles in his jaw moved. Specifically, he said. They arrested me on charges they'd manufactured, ran me through a trial using evidence they'd fabricated and witnesses they'd prepared, sentenced me to life in a facility where I had no access to legal counsel they hadn't already compromised. He said it with the absolute flatness of a man who has repeated this accounting enough times internally that the emotion has been worn off it, like paint off a railing. Then, when I continued to refuse to work for them, they staged my death and moved me to an offshore facility that doesn't appear in any federal registry. I spent 14 months in that facility before a contractor inside their network decided that what they were doing had crossed a line he was no longer willing to manage. Who was the contractor? He's dead now. She absorbed that. He helped you escape. He gave me a window. I made it a door. He checked the mirror again. His name was Carver. He had a daughter in Portland. I don't know if she knows what he did. Something in the way he said it, the specific detail of the daughter in Portland, delivered without sentimentality, but with the weight of something carried carefully, made Nora understand that Damien Voss operated with a particular kind of ledger. Not moral, exactly, but precise. The kind of accounting that doesn't forgive debts or pretend they don't exist. He turned the SUV into the underground parking structure of a transit hub on the east side of the city, drove to the 3rd level, and parked in a corner away from the security cameras she could see him deliberately avoiding. From the bag, he produced a manila envelope. Inside, he said, is a California driver's license, a debit card with $4,000 loaded, and a phone with a clean number. The license is for a woman named Claire Morrow. Brown hair, similar height. The photograph was taken with enough distance that it reads as you if no one looks closely. He held the envelope out. There's also a change of clothes, approximate fit. She took the envelope. You've been carrying this for someone you didn't know. I carry contingencies. This one fit your profile. She looked at the envelope for a moment. Then she opened it and found the clothes. Dark jeans, a gray sweater, flat boots in a size that was close enough. And looked at him. I'm going to change in the car, she said. I'll step out. He got out and stood at the trunk with his back to the vehicle, and she changed in the back seat with the clumsy urgency of someone shedding one life for another, the black dress coming off like something she'd been wrong to wear in the first place. The jeans and sweater going on with the specific comfort of anonymous clothing, the boots fitting well enough. She got out. He turned around and looked at her the way he looked at everything, assessing, cataloging, deciding. Better, he said. I feel like a different person. You are a different person. For now. They stood in the parking structure with the low hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of the transit hub above them. Announcements, the compressed noise of crowds, the mechanical percussion of a city that was now actively looking for her face. "I want to see the garage footage," she said. "Why?" "Because I need to understand what they have." He pulled out his phone and found it in under 30 seconds. A news site had already embedded the clip, running it on loop above a headline that made her stomach contract. She watched herself running through the parking garage in the black dress and bare feet. She watched the lights go out. She watched the backup lights come on red. She watched Damien step into the frame from the left side, the pistol in his hand, his face fully visible for approximately 3 seconds before he moved out of the camera angle. The news site had already enhanced those 3 seconds. His face, sharpened and brightened, sat in a still frame box to the right of the video. Below it, in a font designed to communicate maximum alarm, "Voss alive? Meridian footage triggers federal review." She handed the phone back. 3 seconds, she said. "Enough. Everyone is going to know They already know." His voice was quiet. "That footage didn't go public by accident. Someone inside Section 9 pushed it, which means they've made a decision." "What decision?" He looked at her directly. "They've decided that the controlled story, Voss is alive, Voss is dangerous, the woman with him is his accomplice, is more useful to them than containment. They're not trying to hide me anymore. They're recontextualizing me." He paused. "It means they're not afraid of what I have, which means they think they can move faster than I can." The ventilation hummed. A car drove past them on the level below, headlights sweeping up through the grating. "Can they?" she asked. "Not if we use the next 48 hours correctly." "What does correctly look like?" He was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man running calculations rather than composing a speech. "There's a detective named Elise Navarro," he said. "She ran the original Voss Syndicate investigation. She was the only law enforcement officer in this city who consistently refused to let the case go in directions that people above her were pushing it toward. She's been reopening connected cases for the past 6 months, including the disappearances you've been documenting." Nora went still. "How do you know she's been reopening them?" "Because I've been watching her, for the same reason I've been watching everything in this city." He looked at her. "She doesn't know I'm alive. She doesn't know what Section 9 is, but she's been pulling on the right threads, which means she's either very good or she's being fed information by someone I haven't identified yet. Or both," Nora said. He acknowledged this with a slight movement of his head. "We need to reach her," Nora said. "Yes, but if Section 9 is watching her, they're watching her, which means we can't approach her directly until we have something that makes the approach worth the exposure. I have 6 months of recordings." "You have 6 months of recordings that are currently attached to a fugitive's name. She can't use them in their current form without compromising herself." He turned and walked toward the concrete stairwell at the far end of the level. "We need the ownership documentation, the financial routing, the structural proof that connects the Thorn operations to Section 9's contractor network. That's what transforms your recordings from a local corruption story into something that Navarro can take above the people who've been managing her." She fell into step beside him. "The documentation is in Camden's study," she said. "Or it was. He'll have moved it by now. Some of it. Not all." He pushed through the stairwell door. "Physical documentation is harder to move than people think, especially for someone who wasn't expecting to need to move it this quickly. You want to go back into the building?" "I want to go back into the building." She stared at the back of his head as they descended the stairs. "That's dangerous." "Yes." "He'll have people there." "Yes." "They'll be expecting not both of us, not together, and not at the point of entry I have in mind." He pushed through the ground-level door into a corridor that connected to the transit hub's lower level. Around them, commuters moved with the purposeful blankness of people going somewhere. There's a service access point on the building's north face that isn't on the main security system. It connects to a maintenance corridor that was part of the original structure and wasn't integrated when Thorn Aldrich renovated the building 4 years ago. I identified it 8 months ago. She moved through the commuters beside him, Claire Morrow's face on a license in her pocket, the cracked phone in the other pocket, the clean phone in the coat. "Why did you identify it 8 months ago?" she said. "Because Camden Thorne has been on my list for 8 months." She absorbed this. "His father," she said. "You said his father did business with people you used to know." "His father testified for the prosecution at my trial. Evidence that was—" He paused fractionally. "Evidence that required preparation. That doesn't happen without guidance from someone who understood the architecture of the case. Section 9 guided his testimony. Section 9 made his testimony possible." He turned left at an intersection of corridors, moving with the confidence of someone who has walked this route before. The Thorne family's arrangement with Section 9 goes back 12 years, property, infrastructure, the kind of city-level access that makes certain operations frictionless. And Camden inherited the arrangement. Camden inherited everything. They emerged from the transit hub on the east side, coming out onto a street that was already filling with the mid-morning movement of a city trying to normalize its own new year. The snow was going gray at the edges. Somewhere nearby, someone was playing music from a phone too loudly, something with a bass line that vibrated through the slush. Nora stopped walking. He took 3 more steps before he realized she'd stopped and turned around. She was standing on the sidewalk with her arms at her sides and her face doing the thing faces do when a person is working through something that has just changed shape. "He didn't just know about me," she said. "Camden. He didn't just suspect I was recording him." Damien waited. "He was using me," she said slowly. "He kept me in the apartment, kept me close, let me keep building the file, not to find out how much I had, to find out who I'd connect to." Her voice was steady but thin, the way voices get when the structure beneath them is shifting. "He thought I'd eventually reach someone. He thought I'd lead Section 9 to—" She stopped. She looked at Damien. "To you," she said. Something moved in his eyes, the particular quality of a man confirming something he'd already calculated but hadn't said out loud. "The phone call," she said. 4 days ago. Someone called that line. Someone wanted me to have that number." "Yes." "And you think it was Section 9? "I think it's possible that someone inside Section 9 or someone who knew about the line wanted you to have it, wanted you to panic and call it, wanted your call to ping my location." His voice was level, but there was something beneath it now, a controlled tightness. "Which means it's possible that everything you've done in the past 4 days has been inside a situation someone else constructed." The street moved around them. Indifferent, ordinary. "But your files are real," he continued, "and the documentation in Camden's study is real, and Navarro's investigation is real. If someone used you to find me, they miscalculated what you'd already built, or they knew exactly what I'd built and wanted both of us in the same place." He looked at her. She looked at him. "We're standing in the open," he said quietly. "I know. We need to move." "I know that too." She didn't move yet. "Tell me one thing." "What?" "The line that was inactive for 14 months. The one I called." She held his gaze. "How did it come back online? You said it was buried. You said it had been silent. So how was it active when I called it?" He was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then he said, "I reactivated it 2 weeks ago." The sidewalk felt different under her feet. "Why?" "Because I was ready to start moving. Because I needed a channel that had been dormant long enough that it wouldn't be an active surveillance rotation." His voice was careful now. "Because I needed a way for certain people to find me if they were looking." "Which people?" "People who might have information I needed. Contractors. Former associates who'd been inside Section 9's orbit." He paused. "I didn't anticipate a woman I'd never met calling a number she shouldn't have had." "But you answered." "I answered." The space between that and everything that followed stretched out behind them like a distance they'd already crossed without knowing the terrain. "So it's possible," Nora said carefully, "that the call wasn't arranged by Section 9 at all. It's possible someone inside their network reactivated the line without their authorization, and I called it by random accident, and the whole thing is just chaos," he said, "colliding with preparation." "Which is worse," she said, "in a way, because it means nobody has the full picture." "Nobody ever has the full picture." He looked up at the sky. Gray, flat, the color of something that hadn't decided yet what it was going to do. That's usually when the worst things happen. She started walking. He fell in beside her. They'd gone half a block when his phone vibrated again. He looked at it. His stride didn't change, but something in the rhythm of his breathing did. She noticed it because she'd been paying attention to exactly that kind of detail, the way you do when the person beside you is the only variable you can't fully read. "What?" she said. He held the phone out. A news alert. Different source this time, national. The headline read, "Federal Judge Carol Vance found dead in Meridian home. Authorities seek woman in connection." Below it, her photograph again. A different one this time. Not the work headshot. A personal photograph. The kind that exists on social media. The kind that someone would have to access her accounts to find. And below the photograph, in smaller text that she had to lean in to read, sources indicate the suspect, Noir Ellery, was last seen in the company of convicted organized crime figure Damien Voss, believed to have faked his own death following his 2023 conviction. She read it twice. She'd never heard of Judge Carol Vance. She'd never been within a mile of wherever Carol Vance lived. "They killed a federal judge," she said, "and put your name on it." The cold of the January air was absolute. She felt it in her teeth, in the back of her throat, in the space behind her eyes. "This is the point where I can't go back," she said. "Yes. Even if I turned myself in, you'd be dead within 48 hours. Section 9 has people in every detention facility in this city." He put the phone back in his pocket. "There is no version of this where you walk into a police station and survive it." She stood on the sidewalk in Claire Morrow's clothes with Noir Ellery's face on every news channel in America, accused of a murder she hadn't committed, standing next to a man the entire country believed was a ghost, and felt the specific sensation of a door closing behind her so completely that the room on the other side of it had stopped existing. "Navarro," she said. "Navarro," he agreed. "We need to reach her before they do. We need to reach her before she sees that headline and has to make a choice about what to do with it." They moved. The city moved around them. The new year continued its first gray morning, indifferent to all of it, turning its slow machinery forward the way it always did, regardless of what was happening inside it, regardless of who was running and who was hunting and what had just become permanent and irreversible in the cold and salt gray streets of Meridian. Nora didn't look back. There was nothing left behind her worth the angle. They found Navarro's address in 11 minutes. Damien didn't explain how. He made 2 calls from the clean phone while Nora watched the street from the passenger seat of the green SUV, parked in the loading zone of a dry cleaner that wasn't open yet. And when he hung up the second call, he had a street address in the Crestline district written on the back of a transit stub in handwriting that was small and precise and completely legible. "She lives alone?" Nora asked. "Since her divorce 3 years ago." He pulled out of the loading zone. "She'll be working. The Vance murder is going to pull every detective in the district. She'll have seen the headline, and she'll be trying to figure out how it connects to what she already has. Which means she's already connecting it to me. Which means we have maybe 2 hours before whatever conclusions she's drawing harden into something we can't redirect." The Crestline district was 40 blocks northeast. Middle-income residential, the kind of neighborhood that had been the same for 30 years and intended to stay that way. Brick 2 flats and narrow driveways and bare trees standing in the gray January light like they were waiting for something. Damien drove without apparent urgency, the speed of a man who understands that urgency is visible and visibility is a liability. Nora watched the city go past and tried to construct a version of the next 2 hours that didn't end with them in handcuffs or worse. The math was difficult. Navarro was a detective, trained to be suspicious, operating in a professional context that made trusting a wanted fugitive and a dead crime boss a career-ending proposition at best. They had no way to establish credibility before she made a decision about them. And if she'd already seen the Vance headline, she was operating with a framework in which Noir Ellery was not a sympathetic figure. "She's going to try to detain us," Noir said. "Probably. And you're not going to let that happen?" "No. So we need to give her something in the first 30 seconds that makes detaining us feel like the wrong decision." He glanced at her. Something in the glance that wasn't quite approval but was adjacent to it. The look of someone recalibrating an estimate upward. "The Prescott documentation," he said. "Your photographs from Camden's study. If she's been investigating the disappearances, she'll recognize the ownership chain on the Harlow parcels immediately. She'll know it's not fabricated because it will match what she already has. She has documentation on the Harlow parcels. She's been trying to subpoena them for 4 months. If I show her what you photographed, she'll know immediately that you had access to the primary source, which means your story is real before you finish telling it. Nora nodded. Her hands were steady in her lap, which surprised her. This time yesterday, she'd been getting dressed for a New Year's Eve party, standing in front of a mirror in Camden's penthouse bathroom, telling herself that the plan was solid and the exit was close and she just needed 3 more days. That version of herself felt like a photograph of someone she used to know. The hands that had pinned her hair up last night were the same hands sitting in her lap right now, and the distance between those 2 moments was about 14 hours and a complete structural demolition of everything she'd understood her life to contain. She was surprised to find that she was not falling apart. She filed this away as information about herself that she hadn't previously had. Damien stopped the SUV on a residential block 2 streets from Navarro's address and cut the engine. "We walk from here," he said. "She'll have a window facing the street. Most of these units do. I don't want her to see a vehicle she doesn't recognize parked in front of her building before we ring the bell." "You've thought about this?" "I've thought about approaching Navarro for 6 months. The circumstances are different than I anticipated." He opened his door. "Stay close. If anyone comes out of the building before we get to the door, let me handle the conversation. And if she opens the door with a weapon, then we have 30 seconds to talk faster than she can make a decision." He got out. "Follow my lead." The block was quiet. 2 cars going past in 3 minutes, a dog walker on the far side of the street who wasn't paying attention to anything except the dog. The cold was the kind that had settled in rather than arrived. It had been here long enough to feel like the default state of the air. Nora walked with her hands in the coat pockets and her face angled slightly down. Not enough to look evasive, enough to make her features harder to read at a distance. Navarro's building was a 2-flat gray brick, the front walk recently salted. There were lights on in the upper unit. Damien rang the bell without hesitating. They waited. 12 seconds, which is longer than it sounds when you're standing on someone's front step at 8:40 in the morning with your face on the national news. Then a voice from the intercom, clipped and wide awake. "Who is it?" Not a question, a demand. Damien leaned toward the intercom. "Someone who's been watching your Harlow investigation for 6 months. I have documentation you've been trying to subpoena since September." Silence. Nora counted 8 seconds of it. Then the door buzzed open. The interior stairwell was narrow and smelled like coffee and old carpet. They went up 1 flight. At the top, the apartment door was open. Not all the way, 6 inches, and through the 6 inches Nora could see half of a woman's face and the unmistakable angle of a weapon held low at her side. Detective Elise Navarro was in her mid-40s, dark hair pulled back with the efficiency of someone who'd gotten up and dealt with the important things first. She had the kind of face that had been good-looking before it became interesting. Strong jaw, tired eyes that were currently doing the rapid-focused work of someone cataloging threat vectors. She was in civilian clothes, jeans, and a dark shirt, which meant she'd been working from home. The weapon at her side was a Glock, safety off, her grip on it professional and completely unhurried. Her eyes moved from Damien to Nora and back to Damien. She said nothing for a long moment, then, "You're supposed to be dead." "I know," Damien said. "I watched the footage from the garage." "I know that too. You're wanted in connection with the assault at the Thorne property. The assault that left no one dead and stopped 3 armed men from executing a civilian in a parking garage." "Yes." Her eyes moved to Nora. "Ellery." "Detective Navarro." Nora kept her voice level. "I didn't kill Carol Vance. I've never met Carol Vance. The filing number on the bolo that went out this morning is from a private internal system, not from Meridian PD. Someone pushed it through a media channel that bypasses departmental verification." She paused. "I think you already know that. I think you were looking at it when we rang your bell." Something moved in Navarro's face. Not softening, recalibrating. The expression of someone who has just heard a specific detail that changes the shape of what they were already thinking. She opened the door. "Hands where I can see them," she said. "Both of you." They went in. The apartment was the working space of someone who'd converted her home into a secondary office. Papers on the kitchen table, a corkboard on the living room wall covered in photographs and documents, and colored string, the particular organized chaos of an investigation that had outgrown its official resources. Nora looked at the corkboard as Navarro closed the door behind them. Dale Prescott's photograph was on the board. So was Garver's. And Wolf's. And 3 others Nora didn't recognize. So was a photograph of the Harlow development site, with ownership notations handwritten in the margins. So was, in the upper right corner, a printed photograph that stopped Nora completely. A man she didn't recognize. Middle-aged, unremarkable face, the kind of person who disappears into any room he enters. But below the photograph in Navarro's handwriting, 2 words that made the base of Nora's skull go cold. Section 9. Navarro saw her looking. "Sit down," Navarro said. "Both of you." They sat at the kitchen table. Navarro remained standing, the Glock now holstered, but the holster unsnapped. She poured coffee from a pot on the counter with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who's had difficult conversations before and understands that the quality of the conversation improves when all parties have something to do with their hands. She set cups in front of them. She didn't sit. "You have documentation on the Harlow parcels," she said to Damien. "Not a question, a checkpoint." Damien opened his coat and produced a folded set of papers from an inside pocket. He put them on the table and slid them toward her. She picked them up, read for 40 seconds. Her jaw tightened once, briefly. "Where did you get these?" "My sources are mine," he said. "What matters is whether they match what you have." "They match what I have and then some." She put them down. "These show 2 additional shell companies I hadn't identified." She looked at him. "You've been building this case?" "For 18 months. While being dead." "While being dead." She looked at Nora. "And you?" Nora pulled out her phone, the cracked one, her real one, and laid it on the table. 6 months of recordings, audio from Camden Thorne's private conversations, details of the Prescott arrangement, the Garver payment, and at least 4 other situations I identified with probable connections. Also photographs of physical documentation from his private study. She held Navarro's gaze. "I was trying to build a case I could take somewhere." "You should have taken it to me. I didn't know you existed until 40 minutes ago." Navarro's mouth pressed flat. It wasn't anger. It was the expression of someone absorbing an inconvenient truth without flinching. "The Vance murder," Navarro said. "Section 9, Damien said. "I had the same thought." She turned to the corkboard and touched the photograph in the upper right corner. The unremarkable man. "This is what I've been calling Section 9 for the past 3 months. I didn't know the name. I'd identified a pattern. Federal interference in 3 separate Meridian cases over 8 years, same operational signature. Evidence that disappeared from lockup. Witnesses who recanted. A prosecutor who had a breakdown and resigned the week before a major hearing." She turned back. "I couldn't name it. I couldn't find a name anywhere." "Malcolm Reeve," Damien said. "That's the name that goes at the top." Navarro was very still. "You have provable connection between Reeve and the operational pattern." "I have 14 months of documentation from inside his facility." Damien's voice didn't change. "Yes." Navarro looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone doing a very fast calculation about trust and risk and the specific nature of the situation she'd just stepped into. Then her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Her face changed. Not dramatically, but the micro shift of someone seeing a name they weren't expecting. She answered it. "Navarro?" She listened for approximately 4 seconds. Her eyes went to Damien. "When?" she said. Then, "How many?" Then, "I'll be there in 20. She hung up. Something in the quality of the room had changed. "What?" Damien said. Navarro put the phone in her pocket. Her voice when she spoke had the flatness of someone overriding their own reaction through effort. "There's been a raid," she said. "A storage facility in the warehouse district. Unit registered to a shell company." She paused. "The serial numbers on the confiscated documents match an evidence catalog from the Voss Syndicate trial." Damien was very still. "What facility?" he said. "Kellar Street." "Unit 44. She looked at him. "It was registered under a name I didn't recognize until about 30 seconds ago. Marcus Carver." The name landed in the room like a dropped weight. Damien's face didn't change, but something left it, the controlled animation of a man managing his own responses. And what remained was something older and harder and worse. "Carver is dead," he said. "I know," Navarro said quietly. "Which means someone's been using his name on that unit. For how long, I don't know. But whatever was in it is now in federal custody." Nora looked at Damien. She watched him absorb it. She watched the specific way a person processes the destruction of something they've built in secret over a very long time. Not with visible collapse, but with the particular internal stillness of someone rerouting around a wound because there isn't time to sit with it. "What was in the unit?" he said. His voice was completely level. "The raid report says servers, hard drives, paper documentation and sealed files." Navarro paused. "The same agent who called me said the paper documentation included materials from an offshore facility not on record with any federal registry." She held his gaze. "They have your 18 months, Voss. Whatever you built, whatever you documented, they have it." The portable heater in the corner of the apartment clicked on. Outside, a car went past slowly, the kind of slowly that was either traffic or deliberate. Nora looked at the window. "Damien." He was already looking at it. "That car passed twice," she said. Navarro moved to the wall beside the window, not in front of it, and angled herself to see down the street. Her hand was on the Glock. "Blue sedan," she said. "Plates are—" She stopped. "No front plate. Back plate. Partial. I can't—" She stopped again. It stopped. The three of them were still. Nora felt the specific quality of a room before something happens. The way the air thickens. The way the body starts receiving information before the mind has finished processing it. Her pulse was steady, which surprised her again, the same way her steady hands had surprised her. "We need to move," Damien said. "This is my apartment," Navarro said. "I know, we need to move. If I leave this building with both of you, my career is already over," Damien said, flatly and without cruelty. "The moment you opened that door, Navarro, the moment you were already looking at that bolo number and thinking what you were thinking, the moment you had Section 9 written on your corkboard, it was already over. You've been building toward this for 6 months. You just didn't know where it was going to land." Navarro stared at him. The sedan outside hadn't moved. "Where do we go?" she said. "I have a location outside the city." He was already standing, already reading the room for what they needed and what they were leaving. "You drive. Different vehicle than what you usually use." "My partner's car is in the building's lot. He lets me use it when mine's in service." She was already moving toward the corkboard, pulling down photographs and documents with rapid practiced efficiency, folding them into a file folder. "How compromised is your location?" "The Keller Street unit means they know I've been operating in the warehouse district. They don't have the backup locations. Carver only knew about Keller." "How sure are you?" The pause before his answer was 1 second long, and Nora felt every fraction of it. "Sure enough," he said. They went out through the building's rear, into an alley that connected to the lot. The partner's car was a beige four-door that was as invisible as a car could be, and Navarro drove it with the controlled efficiency of someone who'd been through vehicle pursuits before and understood that looking unremarkable was the first line of defense. Nobody spoke for the first 6 minutes. Then Navarro said, eyes on the road, "The Keller raid. It wasn't random." "No," Damien said from the back seat. "Someone inside my department called it in." She changed lanes. "The agent who called me, he's been cooperative, but there are maybe 3 people in Meridian PD with the clearance level to push a raid request to the federal unit that executed that one. 3 people." Her jaw was set. "One of them is my lieutenant." Nora turned from the front passenger seat to look at Damien. He was looking at Navarro's reflection in the rear-view mirror. "How long has your lieutenant been across your investigation?" he said. "Since October. There was a case review. Mandatory. He saw the Harlow documentation. She paused. He told me I was overextending, told me the disappearances were separate incidents. Another pause, tighter. He was very specific about which threads he thought I should stop pulling. And you kept pulling them. I kept them off my official case files and worked them at home. She looked at the road. Which is why everything on my corkboard is from my personal files. None of it is in the system. But he knew what you had. He saw enough in October to know the direction I was going. She made a turn. Keller Street could have come from him. Then Section 9 has been watching your investigation through your own department. Damien's voice was quiet and precise. Which means your lieutenant has been managing the information flow. Which means anything you've submitted officially in the past 3 months has been filtered. Navarro's knuckles were pale on the wheel for a moment. Then she relaxed them, deliberately, the physical discipline of someone refusing to let her body run ahead of her reasoning. I have a problem with that theory, she said. What problem? My lieutenant is a 22-year veteran. He's difficult and bureaucratic, and he doesn't like loose ends, but he's not... She stopped. He's not the kind of man who facilitates the murder of federal judges. Most people aren't, Damien said, until someone shows them a reason that feels adequate. The beige car moved through mid-morning Meridian, heading toward the outer edge of the city where the density thinned and the highway approaches began. Nora watched the buildings change, commercial, then mixed use, then industrial, the city gradually releasing its grip on the landscape. She was thinking about the Keller Street unit, 18 months of documentation, the evidence Damien had built from inside the negative space of his own death, the material that was supposed to be the structural proof connecting Section 9's financial network to the Thorn operations, the thing that transformed her recordings from a local story into a case that couldn't be buried, gone. We still have my recordings, she said. Yes, Damien said. And the Harlow documentation I photographed? Yes. And whatever's on Navarro's corkboard? Yes. He paused. It's not nothing. But it's not what you had. No, it's not what I had. But he said it without drama. The flat accounting of someone who has already filed the loss and is working on what comes next. Nora turned to look at him fully, over the back of the seat. What was on those servers that we can't reconstruct? She said. He looked at her. For a moment, the controlled surface of his face was something slightly different. A transparency, a brief exposure of what the 18 months had actually looked like from the inside. Communications, he said. Intercepts from the offshore facility, audio, Section 9's internal operational logs from a 2-year period, obtained through a source inside their contractor network who spent 4 months extracting them. He paused. The source died 6 weeks after delivering them to Carver. The logs were the only copy. The car was quiet. There's no other copy anywhere, Nora said. No. And your source? Dead. She sat with that for a moment. Then Navarro said, There's one piece I haven't told you. Her voice had changed. The professional efficiency was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. The register of someone arriving at something they've been circling. The Vance murder, she said. The agent who called me, before he mentioned the Kellar raid, he mentioned something that he framed as routine. Vance had been reviewing a sealed case, a habeas petition. She paused. The petition was filed 14 months ago by someone claiming that the conviction and death of Damien Voss had involved manufactured evidence and falsified forensic records. The car went over a highway overpass, and the city fell away on both sides into distance. Someone filed a habeas petition, Nora said slowly, on behalf of a man they knew had been staged as dead. The petition was filed by a civil rights attorney named Greta Moen, Navarro said. She's been missing since November. The weight of it settled into the car like weather. Mon was working from information someone gave her, Damien said. Very quiet now. Yes. Carver, he said. That would be my guess. Carver. The contractor who'd given Damien a window and made it a door, who had a daughter in Portland, who had decided that what Section 9 was doing had crossed a line. Carver, who'd helped Damien escape and spent 4 months extracting internal logs and filed them in a storage unit under his own name, and then apparently also found an attorney and tried to create a legal mechanism for undoing what had been done. Carver, who was dead. Moan, who was missing. Vance, who'd been reviewing the petition and was now dead. The thread was visible, and it was brutal. Every person who had tried to build a legitimate path through the machinery had been removed from it. "They're not reacting to us," Nora said. "They've been ahead of this for months." "Yes," Damien said. "Then why are we still—" She stopped. She looked at him. "Why are we still alive?" The question was real, and she could see him taking it seriously, not as provocation, but as strategy. He looked out the window at the highway approaching. "Because they made a calculation," he said. "They decided the story of Damien Voss and a fugitive woman is more useful to them alive than dead. Right now. It discredits the evidence. It gives them a narrative." He paused. "The moment we become more dangerous to them with what we know than we are useful to them as a story—" "The calculation changes," Navarro said. "Yes." Navarro took the on-ramp. The highway opened in front of them. 2 lanes, thin traffic, the flat winter landscape of the exurban fringe scrolling out toward the mountains. "The location you mentioned," she said to Damien, "outside the city. An unfinished structure. I've had it prepped for contingency use. We can work from there without exposure." He paused. "There's something else there. Physical documentation that wasn't stored at Keller. I kept a partition in case of exactly this." Nora felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Not hope, but the structural equivalent of it. The sense that the floor, though diminished, was still there. "What documentation?" she said. "A flash drive. Section 9's contractor roster and financial architecture for the past 4 years. Not the operational logs. I couldn't duplicate those. But the money, the names, the infrastructure." He looked at her. "It's not what I had. But combined with your recordings and Navarro's files and the Harlow documentation, it's enough to force an investigation that can't be buried," Nora said. His words from this morning, from what felt like a different version of the day. "If we can get it to the right people." "Who's the right people when Section 9 has—" "Not Meridian, not federal." He looked at the highway ahead. "There are 2 investigative journalists I've been preparing to approach. One is at a national network. The other is international, a wire service based outside the country. If both receive the same package simultaneously, Section 9 can't kill the story without killing it in 2 places at once." He paused. "And there's a federal prosecutor in the Eastern District who Reeve has never been able to compromise. I know, because I've been watching the attempts for 14 months. Navarro was quiet for a moment. "Hargrove," she said. Damien looked at her reflection in the mirror. "You know the name," he said. "She tried to reopen the syndicate trial 2 years ago. She was told to stand down." Navarro's voice was careful. "She stood down publicly." A pause. "She kept a private file." "How do you know that?" Navarro glanced in the mirror. "Because she and I had coffee in October, and she told me something she didn't put in writing." She paused. She said, "When you find the top of this thing, call me first." The highway moved under them. Damien sat in the back seat with whatever he was carrying. The loss of 18 months of work, the weight of Carver's name on a dead attorney's missing person file, the specific arithmetic of what remained against what had been taken, and said nothing for a long time. Then his phone buzzed. He looked at it. He looked at it for long enough that Nora turned around to read his face rather than wait for him to speak. What she saw made the base of her skull go cold again. "What?" she said. He held up the phone. A message. 3 lines. Sent from a number she didn't recognize, but that Damien clearly did, because his face had done the thing it only did when something surprised him. The barely there fracture in the controlled surface, there and gone in under a second. The message read, "We have the flash drive. We've had it since December. We let you believe it was still there. Come to the structure and you'll find what we left for you instead. Bring the woman. Bring the detective. M.R. Malcolm Reeve." Nora read it twice and felt the floor she'd been standing on. The partition Damien had kept, the contingency he hadn't lost, the thing that was supposed to be enough, disappear completely from beneath her. He's been watching the location, Navarro said flatly. For months, Damien said. The quality of his voice was something she hadn't heard from him before. Not broken, but stripped. The way a thing sounds when the insulation has been taken off it, and what's underneath is just the raw conducting material. The flash drive, Noir said. Everything we had left. They have it. Then we have... She stopped. She looked at her cracked phone in her pocket. The recordings. 6 months of her life. Camden's voice, flat and administrative, arranging the permanent resolution of inconvenient people. Partial photographs of physical documents. The work of a woman who hadn't known what she was building or who was watching her build it. She looked at Navarro's file folder on the dash. The corkboard documents, the ownership notations, the photograph of the unremarkable man with Section 9 written beneath him in a detective's careful hand. She looked at Damien in the back seat. He was looking at the phone, at the message, at the 2 initials that represented a man who had been 3 moves ahead of every move they'd made, who had staged a dead man's execution and buried a woman's evidence and killed a judge and framed a fugitive and watched 18 months of careful work accumulate before reaching out and taking it because the taking was more useful than the preventing. He wants us to come to the structure, she said. Yes. Why? Because he wants to close this in a place where it can be managed. Damien put the phone down. He wants us in a location he controls, off camera, away from the city. He wants the recordings, the files, all of it in one place where it can be destroyed without residue. He paused. And then he wants us to be nothing, Damien said. He finished the sentence the way you finish something that was already decided before you started saying it. Flat. Final. The voice of a man who has arrived at a conclusion and is done with the arriving. Navarro drove. The highway unspooled ahead of them, and nobody spoke for 90 seconds. And in those 90 seconds, Nora watched the landscape change from the industrial fringe of the city into the first suggestion of elevation. Scrub trees, frozen ground, the gray sky sitting lower here than it had over Meridian, pressing down toward the hills like it was making a decision about them. He's telling us where he is, Nora said. Both of them looked at her. He sent the message because he wants us to come to him, which means he's already there, which means the structure, whatever it is where he's positioned himself. She kept her voice level. Steady. The same voice she'd used in Camden's apartment for 6 months while something underneath her was doing something entirely different. He thinks we're going to run. He's telling us where the trap is because he's confident we have nowhere else to go and will come to it eventually anyway. That's exactly what he thinks, Damien said. So we go. The silence that followed was different from the previous one, less like absence, more like pressure. He has the flash drive, Navarro said. He has a flash drive, Nora said. We don't know what's on the one he took. Damien looked at her. I made a copy, she said, 6 weeks ago, of my recordings and the Harlow photographs. I put it on a second drive and I mailed it to myself at a P.O. box I opened under a different name in a post office 3 miles from Camden's building. She paused. I hadn't checked it since because I didn't think I needed it yet. And I didn't tell anyone it existed because you didn't trust anyone, Damien said. Because I didn't trust anyone. Something moved in his face, the same fractional shift she'd seen twice before, the ghost of a reaction in a face that had been trained to not have them. The post office, he said. It opens at 9. Navarro looked at the dashboard clock. 8:53. She took the next exit. The post office was a small branch in a neighborhood that was primarily residential and primarily indifferent to anything happening outside its 6-block radius. There was a line of 4 people when they arrived. Nora went in alone. Navarro's instruction, sensible, because Damien's face was currently on every news ticker in the country, and Navarro's badge created paperwork neither of them needed right now. Nora stood in line with Claire Morrow's license in her pocket, and her real face on a wanted bulletin somewhere, and waited her turn with the specific discipline of someone who has learned in the past 14 hours that looking ordinary is a skill she apparently possesses. She retrieved the envelope. She was back in the car in 4 minutes. The drive to the structure took another 40 minutes. Damien directed Navarro from the back seat. Highway to State Road to a county route that hadn't been maintained for at least one winter, the beige car grinding through hard-packed snow in the tracks left by a larger vehicle that had come through recently. The trees thickened. The sky pressed lower. The city was entirely gone. When the structure appeared through the tree line, Nora understood why Damien had chosen it. It was a cathedral, or had been designed to become one. The bones of something ambitious. A massive stone skeleton rising from a clearing in the mountain woods, its walls standing to full height in some sections and tapering to rubble in others. The roof absent everywhere, open to the gray winter sky. Snow covered the stone floor inside. Someone had built temporary scaffolding against the east wall that had been there long enough to rust. There was no glass in any of the window openings, just empty arched frames through which the wind moved freely, carrying the cold from the mountain directly into the interior. 3 vehicles were parked at the tree line 30 meters back from the structure's entrance, 2 black SUVs and 1 unmarked sedan. 4 men visible outside, positioned with the deliberate spacing of people who'd been told where to stand. Professional, patient. The kind of patience that comes from being paid to wait rather than wanting to. Navarro stopped the car behind a stand of trees 200 meters back. 4 outside, she said. More inside. At least 4 more inside, Damien said. Reeve will keep 2 close. The rest are perimeter. We're 3 people, Navarro said. One of us has a service weapon and 17 rounds. I have more than that, Damien said. Nora didn't ask from where. She was looking at the structure through the trees and doing a kind of assessment she didn't have proper vocabulary for yet. Reading the space the way she'd learned to read Camden's moods, the way she'd learned to photograph documents without disturbing the arrangement of papers around them, looking for the shape of the thing before touching it. The scaffolding on the east wall, she said. Damien looked at her. It connects to a window opening at about 30 feet up, she said. If you go in through the window rather than the entrance, you're above the interior sightlines before anyone on the ground has a reference point for you. He looked at the structure, back at her. The roof, he said. What's left of it on the west section? It's stone. The weight of it on that wall has compromised the interior facing. He paused. There are 2 load points on the east side that are structural. If those go, the west section collapses inward. How do you know that? Navarro said. Because I spent 3 months using this building and I know its defects. He looked at the 4 men by the vehicles. There's a maintenance path that runs along the north face, overgrown but passable. It comes out behind the east wall, gives access to the scaffolding without crossing the sight lines of any of the exterior positions. You go up, Navarro said. I go in. No, Damien said. I'm the one with the badge. Your badge doesn't mean anything to these people. It means something when it's on camera. She turned in the driver's seat to face him fully. I have my phone. I have a body cam clipped to my jacket. I put it on when we left my apartment. I go in through the front, on the record, and I give them a choice about whether they want everything they do in the next 30 minutes documented on a law enforcement officer's official equipment. They'll take your weapon. Then I'll be unarmed, which means I'll be clearly not a physical threat, which means the conversation is the play, and I'm better at the conversation than either of you. She looked at him. You go in from above. You don't move until I've given you the picture of the interior and where Reeve is standing. Damien looked at her for a long moment. You understand that the body cam doesn't protect you. I understand that I've been building toward this moment for 6 months without knowing it, same as you, and that if I walk in there with documentation of everything I have and a camera running, killing me becomes a significantly more complex proposition than killing a fugitive in an off-record location. Her voice was level. It's not safety, it's cost elevation. The wind moved through the trees, snow fell from a branch somewhere behind them with a soft collapse. The drive, Damien said to Nora. She held it up. If neither of us comes out of that building, he said, you take Navarro's car and you drive east. Not to Meridian. There's a town called Harker Falls, 2 hours on the state road. There's a motel called the Sunrise on the main route. The owner is a man named Osei, who was a witness at my trial who told the truth when everyone else didn't. He was relocated afterward. He doesn't know I'm alive. Tell him Marcus Carver sent you. Give him the drive and tell him to send it to both of the journalists simultaneously. He has the contact information. I gave it to him 3 years ago because I always intended him to be the contingency. Nora looked at him. You told him 3 years ago. Before the trial, before I knew how it was going to end. He held her gaze. I've been building contingencies for a long time. She closed her fingers around the drive. He got out of the car. The maintenance path was exactly where he'd described it. A narrow break in the undergrowth along the north face, the ground beneath the snow showing the compression of old use. The kind of path that exists because someone made it by repetition rather than intention. He moved along it with the controlled efficiency she'd come to recognize as his baseline physical mode. Not fast, but completely without wasted motion, each placement of his feet deliberate and quiet in the frozen undergrowth. He had a weapon she'd seen him produce from the bag. He had 2 additional things she hadn't seen him produce but suspected from the weight distribution of his coat when he moved. He had 18 months of being dead inside a system that thought it had killed him. She watched him disappear around the north face. She looked at Navarro. Are you actually going in through the front? Nora said. Yes. Navarro checked the body cam, pressed the activation button, watched the small green indicator light come on. You stay with the car. If we're not out in 30 minutes, I heard the instructions. Then you know what to do. I know what he told me to do. Nora looked at the structure through the trees. That's not the same thing. Navarro looked at her for a moment. Don't do anything that gets you killed, Navarro said. Same to you. Navarro got out. She straightened her jacket, settled the holster, looked at the 4 men at the vehicles with the expression of a woman who has been walking toward difficult rooms for 20 years and has simply decided to keep doing it. She walked toward the entrance. Nora watched her cross the clearing. Watched the 4 men register her approach. Watched 2 of them move toward her with the instinctive repositioning of people who'd been trained to manage arrivals. Watched Navarro hold up her badge without breaking stride. Watched her say something that Nora couldn't hear from 200 meters. Watched the interaction become a conversation. Watched one of the men produce a radio. They let her in. The clearing was still. Nora sat in the driver's seat of the beige car and counted her own heartbeats and made it to 47 before she got out. She went in through the window Damien had identified. Not on the scaffolding. She found a gap in the east wall where 2 stones had separated enough to create a rough step sequence, the kind of thing that a person with good balance and no particular concern for their hands could climb if they moved carefully and didn't look down. The wind was brutal at the elevation of the second ledge, the kind of cold that enters through your eyes and the back of your throat simultaneously. She pressed herself against the stone and looked through the window opening into the interior below. The inside of the structure was large and cold and gray, with the flat light coming through the open roof. Snow covered the stone floor in an uneven layer, thicker where the wind had pushed it into drifts against the walls. The scaffolding ran up the east wall from the ground to 3 feet above her position, and from her angle she could see the entire interior floor. Navarro was standing 12 feet from the entrance, her weapon taken, her hands visible at her sides. The man facing her was unremarkable in exactly the way Nora had been warned. Middle-aged, the kind of face that disappears into backgrounds, standing with the easy physical confidence of someone who has been the most dangerous person in every room he'd entered for a long time. 2 men flanked him at distance. 2 more at the far corners. Malcolm Reeve. He was speaking to Navarro in a tone Nora couldn't fully hear. Low. The register of a man accustomed to being listened to rather than overheard. She caught fragments. Unfortunate. The word career. Something that ended with a question mark. She looked for Damien. She found him on the opposite side of the window opening, 3 feet to her right along the interior ledge. He'd come up the scaffolding while she'd been climbing the wall, moving without sound, and he was now positioned above the floor with a clear sight line to Reeve and both flanking positions. He had his weapon in his right hand, held low, and his eyes were moving across the interior with the systematic coverage of someone doing final accounting. He saw her. His expression did something that was almost alarmed, the flicker of a man seeing a variable he hadn't planned for and disliking it intensely. She looked at him steadily. He looked back. He made a small movement with his left hand. Stay. She stayed, but she stayed where she was, not where he'd left her. Below, Navarro's voice became audible, clearer, louder, the the deliberate volume of someone speaking for a record. My name is Detective Elise Navarro, Meridian City Police Department, badge number 7742. I am currently inside an unregistered structure on County Route 16, speaking with an individual I believe to be Malcolm Reeve, in connection with the murders of federal judge Carol Vance, attorney Greta Moan, and the conspiracy to manufacture evidence resulting in the wrongful conviction and false imprisonment of Damien Voss. The space below went completely still. Reeves' expression didn't change, but something around his eyes contracted, the look of a man reassessing the weight of something he'd underestimated. "That's on record," Navarro said. "The body cam has been running since I left the vehicle. Cloud synced. Deleting it requires access to the account, which you don't have." "Detective Navarro," Reeves said. His voice was mild. The mildness of someone who believes mildness is a weapon. "You've made a significant error in judgment today." "I've made a lot of them," she said. "This one feels like the best one so far." Damien moved. Not down, laterally, along the interior ledge, repositioning to a point above the two flanking men rather than above Reeve directly. Nora watched him move and understood the geometry. He was opening an angle that covered both flankers simultaneously, which meant Reeve was temporarily outside his immediate coverage, which meant one of the corner men looked up. She didn't think. She moved along the outside of the wall to the window opening and dropped through it onto the top of the scaffolding, which rang under her feet with a metallic sound that was enormous in the cold interior, and every head in the room turned toward her simultaneously, which was exactly what Damien needed. He came off the ledge. Not a jump, a controlled descent, using the scaffolding's diagonal brace as a slide point, landing on the interior floor behind the right flanker with an impact that he absorbed through his knees and converted immediately into movement. The flanker turned into the muzzle of Damien's weapon and stopped moving. "Don't," Damien said. The word was completely quiet. It carried better for the quiet. The left flanker had his weapon up. Navarro moved. Fast. Faster than Nora had expected from watching her, the speed of someone who'd been waiting for the moment to resolve, grabbing the left flanker's weapon arm with both hands and redirecting the muzzle toward the floor as she drove her elbow into the back of his elbow joint. The sound he made was sharp and involuntary. The weapon dropped. The two corner men were moving. Nora was still on the scaffolding, 6 feet above the floor, and one of the corner men was directly below her and moving toward Navarro with his weapon coming up, and she did the thing that the past 14 hours had apparently been preparing her to do. She jumped. She landed on his back, both arms around his neck, her momentum carrying them both into a stumbling forward collision with the stone wall. He hit it shoulder first, hard enough to bounce, and she went with him into the wall and felt something in her left arm light up with bright specific pain. The dressed wound from the night before, the cut from Camden's ring, reopened now or just transmitting the impact through the healing tissue. She lost her grip. He turned. She was on the floor, one knee down, her arm burning, and he was turning with the weapon, and she put her hand flat on the snow-covered stone and shoved herself sideways, and the shot he fired hit the wall where she'd been, and the noise of it inside the stone structure was enormous. An assault that hit her ears and her chest simultaneously and left a sustained ring in its wake. Then Damien hit the corner man from behind with the particular kind of controlled violence that ends conversations quickly. 2 seconds. Maximum. He crouched beside Nora, his hand on her shoulder, brief, the grip of assessment, not comfort. "Arm," he said. "I'm fine." "Your arm." "I'm fine." She got up. Her knees were working. The arm was burning, but it was functioning. She got up and looked at the room. Navarro had the left flanker's weapon and was covering the right corner. The left flanker and right flanker were on the floor. The man Damien had come down behind was against the wall with Damien's weapon in his face. Reeve was standing exactly where he'd been standing. He hadn't moved. He was looking at Damien with an expression that Nora couldn't immediately categorize. Not fear, not anger. Something more complex and more troubling than either. The expression of a man looking at something he'd written off and finding it substantially more present than his accounting had allowed. "Damien Voss?" he said, mildly, still mildly. "Malcolm." Damien's voice was also quiet, but the mildness was entirely absent. It was the voice of a man who was done with every version of this that wasn't this one. Reeve looked at Nora. "Ms. Ellery," he said, "you've been remarkably tenacious." "I've been told," she said. She was standing 10 feet from him. She had nothing in her hands. The drive was in her pocket. The copy, the real one, the 6 months she'd built in secret. The thing he didn't know existed because she hadn't known it mattered enough to tell anyone. She looked at him and felt something settle in her that was different from fear and different from anger. Something very cold and very clear. The quality of a person who has been pushed through enough in enough hours to have arrived somewhere past the point where ordinary responses apply. "You're recording this," Reeve said to Navarro. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Navarro said. "The cloud account is synced to a server in a jurisdiction you've never operated in." Navarro's voice was level. "You have people inside every federal agency I can name. You don't have people in the Eastern European Data Protection Network that account pings to." She paused. "I set that up in November. After our coffee, Detective Hargrove suggested I think about redundancy." Something moved in Reeve's face for the first time. A fault line. Thin, barely visible, but there. "Hargrove." Damien looked at Navarro. Navarro kept her eyes on Reeve. "She's been building her own partition," Navarro said. "For 2 years. You've been watching me. She's been watching you." A pause. "The difference is that what she has doesn't need to come from a storage unit on Keller Street. It was never in a place you knew to look." The stone walls held the silence. "You can't win this," Reeve said, but the mildness had changed quality. It was still controlled, but it was working harder than it had been. "I don't need to win it," Damien said. "I need to outlast your ability to suppress it. Those are different problems." He moved forward 1 step. "You faked my death. You took 14 months of my life in a facility that doesn't appear on any federal map. You killed Carver and Mon and Vance, and you moved against an attorney and a detective and a woman who was simply paying too much attention to the things you wanted ignored." Each sentence landed clean and separate. "And you did all of it because you convinced yourself that the necessity justified the method." Reeve said nothing. "I'm going to ask you one question," Damien said, "and I want you to think about it carefully, because it's the only version of the next few minutes that offers you anything." Reeve waited. "The roster," Damien said. "Your full contractor network, names, cells, operational territories, the complete financial architecture from the beginning." He paused. "You give that to me now, on the record, on Navarro's body cam, and what comes next for you is the law, which is worse than you deserve and better than what I would otherwise choose." The wind moved through the stone windows. The snow on the floor didn't move. Reeve looked at Damien for a long time. Then he smiled. It was a small smile, and it was worse than no smile at all, because it was the smile of a man who has one more thing and knows it. "You think the roster is the top of this," Reeve said quietly. "You've been building toward the roster like it's the ceiling." He tilted his head slightly. "Voss, the roster is a floor. The people above it don't appear in any document you've ever seen, in any facility you were ever held in any operational log that Carver could have accessed." He paused. "You've been building a case against a middle manager for 18 months. The stone room held this. Nora watched Damien's face. It didn't collapse. It didn't show the thing a lesser person's face would show. But she'd been watching it long enough now to read the subterranean register. The fractional compression around his eyes, the quality of stillness that meant something underneath the surface was being weighed and found different than expected. "Then give me the ceiling," Damien said. "I give you the ceiling, I'm dead before morning." Reeve's voice was still mild, still carrying that awful quality of a man who believes he is the calmest person in any room he enters. "The people above me don't make the same mistakes I've made. They don't leave things in storage units. They don't have contractors who develop inconvenient consciences." He looked at Damien with something that was almost honest. "They will end this entire situation, including everyone currently standing in this building, if I give you a path to them." "Then you're the ceiling," Navarro said. Reeve looked at her. "You're the highest point anyone can prove," she said, "which means you're what goes on the record. Today." She moved closer, the weapon steady. "Malcolm Reeve, You are under arrest for the murders of Carol Vance, Greta Moan, and the conspiracy to... Reeve moved, not toward any of them, toward the east wall, and the movement was so sudden and so completely at odds with the quality of stillness he'd maintained that it registered for a fraction of a second as something wrong with Nora's perception rather than something happening in the room. He crossed 4 meters in a way that a man his age and build shouldn't have been able to cross 4 meters, and hit a section of scaffolding brace and went up it with the mechanical speed of someone who had planned this exact exit before he'd ever walked into the building. Damien was already moving. He cleared the floor in 3 strides and took the scaffolding 4 rungs at a time, and the metallic ring of both of them ascending the structure simultaneously filled the stone interior with a chaos of echoing sound. Navarro was at the base, covering the door. One of the men on the floor was starting to move, and she redirected her attention with the flat precision of someone who has exactly enough attention to distribute and is distributing it correctly. Nora ran, not toward the scaffoldings, toward the east wall gap she'd come through, the rough stone steps, because Reeve was heading for the window opening and the exterior, and if he got over the wall he had vehicles and she had nothing. She hit the exterior face of the wall and climbed faster than she'd climbed going in, the burned arm screaming its specific objection, the cold turning her fingers unreliable on the stone surface. She got to the top of the wall and looked over. Reeve was on the scaffolding exterior, 12 feet below her, descending. Damien was 4 feet above him, descending faster. Below them both, 60 meters across the clearing, 2 of the exterior men were running toward the structure, alerted by the noise, repositioning. Reeve hit the ground. He ran, not toward the vehicles, laterally, along the exterior wall, toward the north face and the maintenance path, and Nora understood immediately. He knew the path. He'd studied the structure as carefully as Damien had. He knew the exit that didn't go through the clearing. Damien hit the ground 6 seconds behind him. The gap was too much. Nora looked at the exterior scaffolding below her and did a calculation that involved her arm and the distance and the 2 men in the clearing converging on the east face, and she stopped calculating and went over the wall. She came down the scaffolding exterior with her right hand doing most of the work, and her left arm braced against the frame rather than gripping it, and she hit the ground in the frozen undergrowth at the base of the east wall and turned toward the north face. She could hear them in the maintenance path. Footfalls in hard snow, the irregular rhythm of a chase. 2 people, the cadence of effort, the sound of frozen undergrowth being pushed through. She ran parallel to the wall. The maintenance path opened to her right, and she turned into it and ran into the tree line. Branches across her face, snow coming off the understory, her breath coming in hard, visible clouds that meant nothing because there was no one left to see them. And the path turned, and she came around the turn and stopped. Reeve was on the ground. Damien was standing over him, and the quality of the air and the small space between the trees had the specific density of something that was about to go one of 2 ways and hadn't decided yet. Reeve was breathing hard. His face was cut from a branch or a fall. His hands were empty. He was looking up at Damien with the expression of a man who has run his calculation and arrived at an answer he doesn't like. Damien's weapon was in his hand. His hand was steady. The trees stood around them in the cold, indifferent, their bare branches making the gray sky into a broken grid above the 3 of them. And the sound of the cathedral behind them, Navarro's voice, something metallic, the movement of people in a stone structure, was distant enough to feel like it belonged to a different sequence of events. Nora stood at the turn in the path. Damien looked at her. Reeve looked at Damien. "You won't," Reeve said. It wasn't a challenge. It was an assessment. The tone of a man who has spent a long time reading people and believes he is reading this one correctly. Because if you do, the ceiling stays intact. The people above me walk away clean. Everything you've built becomes the story of a dead criminal who came back and killed a federal officer. He paused. He was still breathing hard, but the mildness was reasserting itself, the way a gas reasserts its shape after you stop compressing it. "You need me alive and talking." Damien's expression was very still. "Or," Reeve said, "you need me in a condition where talking is the only option left." He looked up at Damien with something that was almost terribly like the beginning of a negotiation. "I can give you the ceiling, Voss, not the names. I won't survive giving you the names, but the architecture. The financial structure, the mechanism. He paused. I can give you enough that the people above me can't operate without being seen, which is almost as good as naming them. His eyes moved to Nora, then back to Damien. But not here. Not to a body cam. Through Hargrove. Directly. In a controlled environment where the documentation is built properly. And I have legal... No, Damien said. I need you to stop talking, Damien said, about what I need. The silence between them had the quality of weight. Nora looked at the weapon in Damien's hand, at the steadiness of it, at the specific quality of stillness in a man who is standing in a moment he has been moving toward for 18 months and has arrived at it and found it different than the shape he expected it to have. She said his name. Just his name. He looked at her. She held up the drive. He looked at it. The wind came through the tree line and knocked snow from the branches above them, and it fell across all three of them in a soft, cold cascade, indifferent and complete. And somewhere behind them in the stone structure that had been built to become something magnificent, and had instead become whatever this was, Navarro was on her radio, and the sound of it carried clearly through the winter air, and what Nora could make out, in the cold and the stillness after the snow had fallen and before anything else happened, was the word Hargrove. And then the word now. The word now finished its echo through the winter trees, and then everything happened at once. Hargrove's people came in from the northern approach, 4 vehicles moving fast along the county route, no sirens, the deliberate silence of an operation that wanted arrival rather than announcement. Nora heard the engines before she saw the headlights cutting through the tree line, and she understood in the same moment that Navarro had been holding the phone the entire time, that the call had been live since the body cam went on, that Elise Navarro had walked into that stone building already connected to the one person in the federal system who had been waiting 2 years for exactly this. Reeve heard the engines too. He turned his head toward the sound and something crossed his face. Not panic, but the very precise recalculation of a man who has just discovered that the geometry of the situation is different from what he'd been working with. The mildness fractured. Underneath it was something older and less composed, the face of a person confronting a specific type of ending they'd spent years engineering for other people. Damien lowered the weapon. He looked at Reeve on the ground with the expression of a man completing a long piece of work and finding that the completion feels nothing like he'd imagined it would. Not satisfaction, not relief, something emptier and more honest than either. Get up, he said. Reeve got up. Slowly, with the careful movement of a man taking inventory of his own condition. His face was cut along the left cheekbone where a branch had caught him in the run, a thin line of dark blood on pale skin. He stood in the maintenance path with his hands at his sides and looked at Damien with the last remnant of the mildness, the professional composure of someone refusing to let the final image of themselves be undignified. You understand this doesn't end it, Reeve said. I know, Damien said. The people above will be someone else's problem. Eventually, Damien's voice was flat and honest. You're mine. Nora stepped back as the first of Hargrove's people came through the tree line. 2 agents, weapons drawn, moving with the practiced efficiency of people executing a plan they'd been briefed on thoroughly. They took Reeve by both arms, and he went with them without resistance. The final composure of a man who understood that resistance was a form of information he was no longer willing to give. She watched them take him back through the trees toward the clearing. She looked at Damien. He was standing in the maintenance path with his weapon holstered and his hands at his sides, watching Reeve disappear through the undergrowth. The cold was absolute around them. Her left arm was a continuous low fire of pain. Her feet were wet from the snow. The adrenaline that had been running her for the past 3 hours was beginning to metabolize into something that felt like the structural equivalent of a building after the load-bearing event. Still standing, but aware now of everything it had absorbed. She became aware that she was shaking, not visibly. Inside, the kind of tremor that lives below the surface and announces itself to the person experiencing it and no one else. She breathed. Damien turned. He looked at her with the full attention he'd been giving to threat assessment for the past 12 hours, redirected now toward her specifically, and it was a different quality of attention. Less cataloging, more present. He didn't say anything for a moment, then, Your arm. It's manageable. It needs to be looked at properly. There are more important things happening. There will be people here who can look at it properly. He moved toward the clearing. Come. She followed him. The clearing had been reorganized in the time they'd been in the trees. 3 of the interior men were in custody, secured and sitting against the exterior wall of the structure with their hands zip-tied, and the particular expression of people who had been very confident this morning and were now in the process of adjusting their understanding of how the day had gone. Navarro was standing near the lead vehicle, talking to a woman in a dark coat that was too thin for the temperature, late 40s, severe-featured, the kind of face that had been hardened by institutional combat rather than physical, carrying a tablet and speaking into a phone and managing 3 separate threads of something simultaneously without appearing to break a sweat. Hargrove. Nora recognized the quality of her even before Navarro turned and gestured toward them. The particular kind of person who has spent years being told to stand down and stood down outwardly and kept building inwardly, the long patience of someone who knew the moment would come because they'd been ensuring it would come. Navarro met them halfway. She looked at Nora's arm. Medical is 2 minutes out. I'm fine. You're not fine, you're functional, which is different. Navarro looked at her with the direct assessment of someone who'd spent the morning being surprised by a civilian and had recalibrated accordingly. You were supposed to stay with the car. I was in the area. Something almost like a smile moved across Navarro's face. Gone before it fully arrived, the involuntary response of a person who is too tired for humor, but not entirely immune to it. Hargrove needs the drive, Navarro said. Nora produced it from her pocket, held it for a moment, the weight of 6 months sitting in her palm, the recordings, the photographs, the careful patient work of a woman who had been afraid and done it anyway. Then she held it out. Navarro took it. The copy is what matters, Nora said. There's a second copy with a man named Osei in Harker Falls. Damien. She looked at him. I'll reach Osei, Damien said. He should hear from someone he knows. He paused. He should know about Carver. Navarro took the drive toward Hargrove. Nora stood in the clearing with the stone structure behind her and the thin winter sky above, and the sound of the operation reorganizing itself around her. Vehicles, voices, the compressed professional activity of people executing a process, and felt the specific sensation of a moment that has been running at full speed arriving at the point where it slows. The medical team came and they looked at her arm, and the cut had reopened significantly, but was clean and the tissue hadn't torn further, and they dressed it properly this time, with materials that weren't from a first aid kit on a cold concrete floor, and she sat on the running board of one of the vehicles and let them work, and looked at the stone structure across the clearing and breathed. Damien sat down beside her when the medical team moved to address a cut on his forearm he'd apparently sustained somewhere in the scaffolding descent and hadn't mentioned. She looked at the cut. That needs stitches. Probably. You didn't say anything. There were other priorities. She looked at him. He was looking at the structure, at the empty window openings, the open sky above the roofless walls, the rust-colored scaffolding against the gray stone. Looking at it the way you look at a place after something significant has happened in it, trying to reconcile the space with the event, finding that they don't quite resolve into each other cleanly. It's over, she said. Not a question. Testing how the words felt. This part of it, he said. Reeve. We'll give Hargrove what she needs to dismantle the operational network, not the ceiling. He was telling the truth about that, or the version of the truth he believes, but enough to make Section 9 non-functional. He paused. The people above him are a different problem, a longer one. But not yours. He was quiet for a moment. Not today. The medical team finished with his arm, and he watched them tape it with the same remote attention he gave to most things that were happening to his body rather than by it. Carver, Nora said. Damien didn't answer immediately. He had a daughter in Portland, she said. Yes. She should know what he did. Yes. A pause. I'll find a way to reach her, not directly. Through someone she can trust. He looked at his arm. Carver made 3 decisions in his life that most people wouldn't have made. The first was to help me out of the facility. The second was to spend 4 months extracting operational logs under a level of surveillance that would have paralyzed most people. The third was to find Moan and start the legal process. He was quiet for a moment. He knew what the risk of each of those decisions was. He made them anyway. She looked at him. Like someone else I've spent the past 14 hours with. He looked at her. She held the look. You made a decision in a parking garage this morning, she said, with no information about who I was or what I had. You answered a phone and then you walked into a room full of people who wanted to kill me. She paused. I've been trying to understand the calculation that led to that. I told you the calculation, he said. Your recordings. I know what you told me, she said. I'm asking about the part you didn't tell me. The clearing moved around them. An agent crossed in front of them carrying a box of documentation. One of the secured men said something and nobody responded. Damien looked at the structure. A year ago, he said, in the facility, there was a period of about 3 months where I stopped building, stopped documenting. I had the materials, I had the time, I had everything I needed to keep constructing the case. He paused. The pauses with him were never empty. They were the sound of a man being precise about something he doesn't say inexactly. I stopped because I couldn't find a reason that was larger than the process. The building toward something had started to feel identical to the thing it was meant to oppose. Systematic, cold, oriented toward outcome rather than toward anything human. She waited. Then Carver gave me the window, he said, and I came to Meridian. And I spent 8 months watching a city that had moved on from me as though I'd never existed. Watching the structures that had used me continue operating. Watching the people I'd worked for and against and alongside living in the ordinary continuity of their lives. He stopped, and I started to think that the case I was building was the only thing I was anymore, that there was no version of completing it that left anything on the other side. He looked at her, direct, the way he looked at things when he decided they deserved the full attention. When you called, he said, you were terrified, and you called a deadline, and you expected nothing to answer. And something in that, the specific quality of someone reaching into the dark because reaching is all that's left. I answered it before I decided to answer it. He paused. I can't give you a calculation for that. She held his gaze. You're a very difficult person to know, she said. I've been told. I don't mean it as a criticism. I know. Navarro came back across the clearing. She moved like a woman who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just set it down and was recalibrating to the new weight of herself. She sat on the running board on the other side of Nora and looked at the structure and said nothing for a while. Then, Hargrove is satisfied. With the drive, Nora said. With everything. The body cam footage, the drive, the documentation I pulled from my corkboard. She paused. She said she has enough to open a federal case that can't be buried because it'll be in 3 jurisdictions simultaneously within 24 hours. A pause. She also said something else. Nora looked at her. She said Camden Thorne was picked up at his property at 7 this morning. Separate operation, Meridian PD, moving on the original corruption investigation. The one that's been building through normal channels independently of any of this. Navarro's voice was careful. The recordings you made are now formally submitted as evidence in a state case. Your status as a fugitive has been suspended pending review of the manufactured BOLO. She paused once more. The Vance murder. Hargrove's people have Reeves' communications from last night. It's his operation, full stop. Your name is going to be cleared. Nora absorbed this. She'd been expecting to feel something large when this moment arrived. Some release, some structural shift, the sensation of a weight physically departing. What she actually felt was smaller and more specific. The unwinding of something that had been wound very tight for a very long time. Not dramatic, just the slow release of tension from a body that had been holding it for months. She thought about Dale Prescott and her cat in the sunbeam. She thought about Garver and Wolf and Moan. She thought about Carver, who'd had a daughter in Portland and made 3 decisions most people wouldn't make. It doesn't feel like enough, she said quietly. Not to either of them specifically. Just placing the truth of it in the cold air. No, Navarro said. It doesn't. They sat with that for a moment, the three of them, which was its own kind of acknowledgement, the honest refusal to perform a satisfaction that wasn't present. Then Navarro stood up, back into herself, the detective's posture, the forward orientation of someone who processes through action rather than stillness. I have about 6 hours of work that needs to be done before I can sleep. She looked at Nora. There will be a formal statement process. Probably tomorrow. I'll be with you through it. Thank you, Nora said. Navarro looked at her for a moment, then at Damien. I spent 9 months trying to understand who built the Voss Syndicate trial, she said to him. What it was actually built on. I kept finding the load-bearing elements and then finding that they connected to things that shouldn't have been connected. She paused. I'm sorry it took me as long as it did. Damien looked at her. You were working with what you had. So were you. She held his gaze for a moment. What happens to you now? He didn't answer immediately. That depends on conversations that haven't happened yet, he said. Hargrove, we'll want what I have, what I can reconstruct from memory and from the materials they didn't find. He paused. I'm prepared to give it, under conditions. What conditions? That it's used and not managed. He said it without heat, the simple statement of a man who has had information managed before and knows the specific way it dies. That the cases it builds are prosecuted rather than leveraged. That the people above Reeve, when they're identified, face the law rather than become bargaining instruments in a process that ends with them walking away clean. Navarro looked at him for a long time. I can't promise that, she said. I don't have the authority. No, he said. But Hargrove does. And she knows I can walk away from this conversation and take what I know back into the dark with me, and she'll never find it. He paused. Which means she's motivated to offer terms she'll keep. You trust her? I trust her interest in completion over containment. He paused. Which isn't the same as trust, but it's functional. Navarro nodded slowly. Then she walked toward Hargrove, and the two of them watched her go, and the clearing continued its organized work around them, and the gray winter sky sat above the stone skeleton of the structure and didn't offer any opinion about any of it. The conversation between Damien and Hargrove happened later, inside one of the vehicles with the doors closed, and Nora didn't hear any of it. She stood near the eastern tree line with her dressed arm and her borrowed coat and watched the mountain trees move in the light wind and tried to locate herself in the sequence of what had happened. 14 hours ago, she'd been running barefoot through a parking garage. Before that, she'd been at a party, standing in a room full of people she didn't know, wearing a dress she'd been asked to wear, performing a version of herself she'd spent 2 years slowly understanding was a performance. An agent came and asked her several questions that were the beginning of the formal process, and she answered them clearly and completely. And when the agent left, she stood in the cold and felt the specific quality of a person who has been inside an emergency for long enough that the emergency has become the baseline and must now reckon with what comes after. She didn't know what came after. She knew what came immediately. Statements, process, the long institutional mechanism of accountability beginning its slow grinding work. She knew Camden would face trial, and that the trial would be difficult, and that her recordings would be at the center of it, and that she would have to be there for it, present and precise, for as long as it took. She knew the names of the people she'd documented, Garver, Wolfe, Prescott, would be said aloud in rooms with legal weight behind them, and that this was not justice exactly, but it was the closest the available machinery could produce, and she'd decided sometime in the past 14 hours that the closest the available machinery could produce was worth fighting for. She knew Moan was still missing. She knew that somewhere above Reeve there were people who hadn't been touched today and wouldn't be touched quickly. She knew that the architecture Damien described, the mechanism that sat above Section 9 and used it the way Section 9 had used the Syndicate, would take years to dismantle, if it could be dismantled, and that the people responsible for building it existed in the space where power and patience intersect, which is the most protected space there is. She held all of this without flinching. Then Damien came out of the vehicle. He walked toward her across the clearing with the long, unhurried stride of a man who has just completed a negotiation and is doing the inventory of what it cost and what it produced. His face was the same as it had been since she'd first seen it in the red emergency light of the parking garage. Controlled, angular, the scarred knuckle on his left hand visible below his sleeve. But there was something different in it now, something that she'd been watching develop in increments over the past 14 hours and couldn't name cleanly except as the slow return of a thing that had been absent for a very long time. He stopped beside her. "Hargrove," she said. "Agreed to the terms. All of them. Enough of them." He looked at the structure. "It'll take time. The cases we can build from what I have, they won't move quickly. The people at the top are patient. Dismantling them requires more patience. Do you have it?" He looked at her. "I've been practicing for 18 months. She almost smiled. The sensation of it was strange on her face, like using a muscle that had been immobilized. "What happens to you?" she said. "Legally. Hargrove is working on the framework. The conviction was based on manufactured evidence. Reeves' people are already documenting the fabrication as part of their cooperation agreement. The exoneration process will take months, possibly longer." He paused. "During which time I'll be cooperating with the federal investigation under terms that keep me functional." "Not imprisoned." "Not imprisoned." She nodded. "In Camden's trial," he said. "I'll be there for it." "It will be difficult." "I know." She looked at the mountains beyond the tree line, the way they sat in the winter air with their specific quality of indifferent permanence. He was very good at making me doubt my own perceptions. For a long time. I kept finding things and then finding reasons the things might not mean what they looked like they meant. She paused. "Standing up in a courtroom and saying what I know, clearly and without qualification, I think I need to do that. Not just for the case, for something that's mine." He was quiet for a moment. "Dale Prescott," he said. "Yes." "And the others." "Yes." He didn't offer anything in response to this. No comfort, no reframing, no version of the thing people say when they want the weight of reality to feel lighter than it is. He just stood beside her in the cold and let the truth of it be the size it was, which was the right thing to do, and she recognized it as such. They stayed in the clearing until the operation had processed to the point where Nora was released into Navarro's custody for transit back to the city. Hargrove's people needed the structure for the next several hours. Evidence collection, documentation, the specific institutional work of turning a morning's events into a legal architecture that could survive scrutiny. Before she got into the vehicle, Nora turned. Damien was standing near the eastern tree line, speaking to one of Hargrove's agents, quietly, with the focused attention of someone transferring something important and wanting it received correctly. He had a battered notebook in his hand that she hadn't seen before, and the agent was writing in a pad of her own, and the scene had the quality of something being carefully passed from one set of hands to another. She watched him for a moment. He looked up. Across the clearing, through the cold morning air, they held each other's gaze for a count of 3. She got in the car. Navarro drove them back down the county route toward the highway and the city, and they didn't speak much for the first 20 minutes, which was its own kind of conversation. The comfortable silence of two people who have been through the same significant thing and don't need to perform a response to it. Eventually, Navarro said, "What are you going to do?" Nora looked at the highway. "Today?" "After." She thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet. My apartment, Camden's building, his lease, all of it. I need to disentangle myself from the entire material structure of the past 2 years." She paused. "My work. The Planning Commission knew I was engaged to Camden. They're going to have questions about what I knew and when. Your cooperation with the investigation will be documented. It'll count." "Maybe." She looked at the road. "I think I need to go somewhere quiet for a while. After the statements, after the initial process." She paused. "I've been in survival mode for 6 months. I don't know what I'm like when I'm not." "You're probably like this," Navarro said. Nora looked at her. Navarro kept her eyes on the road, but the corner of her mouth moved slightly. "Paying attention, making connections, doing the work when no one told you to and no one was watching." She paused. "That's not survival mode, that's just who you are." Nora looked back at the highway. She held this for a moment and found that she didn't want to deflect it or argue with it. She took it in and let it sit, and it felt, in a quiet way, like something she'd needed to hear from outside herself to believe. The city appeared ahead of them on the flat horizon, the winter skyline of Meridian doing what it always did. Sitting there in its complicated density, holding everything it held without apology or explanation, the place where all of this had started and would continue and would slowly, incrementally, be accounted for. Nora looked at it. She'd been afraid of this city for 6 months, afraid of what it contained, of who it protected, of the specific way its structures could be used to disappear people who'd seen too much. Some of that fear was still present. She was honest enough not to pretend the past 14 hours had resolved it entirely. But it had changed shape. It sat differently now in her chest, less like something paralyzing and more like something useful. The specific alertness of a person who has learned what the city is capable of and has decided to stay informed. The weeks that followed were long and institutional and sometimes almost unbearable. The statements took 3 days. Formal, recorded, transcribed, reviewed, challenged at specific points by lawyers whose job was to challenge, and each challenge met by Nora with the patient precision of a woman who had spent 6 months being meticulous specifically against the eventuality of being challenged. Camden's attorneys were aggressive in the early sessions, and less so as the recordings were played and the photographs were admitted, and the Harlow ownership documentation was submitted, and the legal architecture of what he'd done became visible in the plain light of a formal proceeding. Camden himself she saw twice during the process. Once through a glass partition in a courthouse hallway, being moved with his attorneys, his face carrying the qualities she'd spent 2 years learning to read: the controlled surface, the flat administrative certainty. The certainty had a crack in it now, visible from 30 feet away to someone who knew exactly where to look. The second time was across a formal room during an evidentiary hearing, and he looked at her with a quality she hadn't seen before and couldn't entirely name. And she held his gaze for 3 seconds and then looked away, not because she couldn't hold it, but because he wasn't owed any more of her attention than what the process required. She gave the process what it required. Every time. Completely. Navarro was there for each session, as promised, not always speaking but present. The specific presence of someone who has decided that witness is a form of support and is offering it consciously. The exoneration process for Damien moved more slowly, as he'd said it would. The legal deconstruction of a manufactured conviction required the kind of institutional patience that existed in direct opposition to the pace of everything Nora had experienced in the past weeks. And she watched it from a distance, through Navarro's updates, with the frustrated understanding that the law's slowness was also its integrity, and that she'd chosen to believe in the machinery even when it ground slowly. She reached Osei herself 2 weeks after the clearing, driving alone to Harker Falls on a gray Tuesday in January. She found the Sunrise Motel on the main route exactly where Damien had described it. Small, clean, a man behind the front desk who had the face of someone who had been through something significant and had built a life on the other side of it that was careful and small and entirely his own. She told him Marcus Carver's name. Osei looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I heard he died." "Yes," she said. "He was a good man. In the end." He paused. He wasn't always before, but in the end, he was. "I know," she said. She told him what Carver had done, all of it. She didn't truncate it or soften it because she'd decided that Carver was owed the full account of his own choices being stated clearly, even if the only listener was a man in a small motel in a town 2 hours from the city. Osei was quiet for a while after she'd finished. Then he said, "Damien is alive." Yes. He absorbed this with the stillness of a man receiving information that reorganizes a significant structure inside him. He looked at his hands on the counter. Then he looked at her. "Is he—" He stopped. Started again. "Is he all right?" She thought about this honestly. About a man in a maintenance path in the winter trees with a weapon in a steady hand. About a man sitting on a running board in the cold, his arm cut and his voice flat, giving a final account of 18 months inside a life that had been taken from him. About the fractional shifts in the controlled surface, the ghost of reactions, the moment in the parking garage when he'd moved between her and the men with the guns, before she'd understood what was happening. "I think he's working on it," she said. Osei nodded slowly. This seemed to satisfy him, or at least to fit something he already understood about the person in question. She drove back to the city that evening and let herself into the temporary apartment she'd been placed in, a furnished short-term rental in a neighborhood she didn't know yet, which she'd decided to treat as an opportunity rather than a displacement. And she sat on the floor with her back against the couch and looked at the wall and breathed for a long time. The nightmares started 2 weeks in. She'd been expecting them earlier, had been waiting for them during the first days, and been quietly unnerved by their absence, as though her sleeping mind was still in the same crisis mode that her waking one had been and hadn't registered the shift. They arrived instead in the third week, reliably, between 2 and 4 in the morning. Camden's voice, mostly, saying things he'd actually said and things her mind invented from the material of what he was. The parking garage, the red light, the specific sensation of running barefoot on cold concrete while something in her chest said, "This is real, this is actually happening." She didn't call anyone during these nights. She got up and made coffee and sat at the window and looked at the city and let the nightmares be the size they were without trying to compress them smaller than they needed to be to process. It was its own kind of discipline, she found, different from the discipline of the 6 months before. Less strategic, more direct. The work of letting the thing that happened to you be acknowledged by the part of yourself that you'd been running too fast to consult. 3 months after the clearing, on a Wednesday evening in late April, when the winter had finally released its grip on Meridian and the city was doing the thing it did when spring arrived, releasing collectively, tentatively, like an organism that doesn't quite believe the threat has passed, she was closing her bookstore. She'd opened it 6 weeks earlier. It was a small place, second-hand primarily, with a narrow front room and a back room that was still being organized, on a side street in a neighborhood that was the kind of neighborhood that would support a small bookstore, because the people in it were the kind of people who believed in small bookstores on principle and also liked having somewhere to go on Saturday afternoons. She'd started it the way she'd started the documentation 6 months before the clearing, carefully, without announcing it to anyone, building something that was entirely hers in a form that she controlled. She was locking the front door when she looked down and saw the envelope on the floor just inside the threshold. The small gap at the base of the old door, wide enough for something thin to be pushed through. Inside the envelope was a Metro token. Meridian City Transit, old enough that the surface finish had worn smooth in the middle where a thumb would hold it. And a card, small, the kind that comes with flowers except without the flowers. 4 lines, handwritten. The handwriting small and precise and completely legible. You gave a dead man one last reason to fight. The cases will take years. The ceiling will be someone's problem eventually. I'm told Osei says hello. She read it twice. She held the token in her palm and felt the weight of it. Almost nothing. The weight of a small metal disc worn smooth by years of passing between hands, and looked up through the glass of the door at the street outside. April evening. The last light going amber on the buildings across the way. People moving on the sidewalk in the unhurried way of a city that has decided, collectively, to enjoy a mild evening. A couple with a dog. A man on a bicycle. 2 women talking outside the coffee place next door with the quality of people who have more to say than the temperature will allow. And at the far end of the block, where the street bent away from her sight line into the next intersection, a figure in a dark coat moving with a familiar quality of deliberate unhurry. The gait of a man who has learned to move through cities as though he belongs to them without belonging to them, who has made a kind of peace with the condition of being present and unanchored simultaneously. She was at the door and had her hand on the lock before she'd made the decision to move. She came out onto the sidewalk. The block was between her and the corner, not far. 40 feet, maybe 50. She opened her mouth. The figure turned the corner. She walked to the corner quickly, not running, the Metro token in her fist, and she turned onto the next street and looked down its length in the amber evening light. And she looked at every figure moving in both directions, and she looked until the people thinned out toward the far intersection, and the last of the light lay flat and golden on the pavement. He was gone. She stood on the corner for a moment. The city moved around her, doing what it always did, holding everything it held, offering nothing it wasn't asked for, keeping its secrets and its histories inside its stone and glass and brick, the way cities always do, patient and indifferent, and somehow, despite everything, still legible to the people who'd learned to read it. She looked down at the token in her palm. Then she put it in her pocket. She walked back to the bookstore, unlocked the door, went inside, and finished closing up. She turned off the lights in the back room and the front room. She locked the register. She stood for a moment in the dark of her own small place and breathed the smell of old paper and the particular quiet of a room full of other people's stories. She turned off the last light. She locked the door behind her. She walked home through the spring evening with her hands in her pockets and the token against her palm, and the city doing what the city did around her, and she didn't look back. She'd learned in the past 4 months that looking back was a way of standing still. She had too much ahead to afford it.